He was the gangster who dined with presidents, whispered with spies, and ruled Chicago as if it were his stage. But when the music stopped, Sam Giancana's dance ended not in glory, but in blood and silence. Chicago in the early 1900s was a city that breathed smoke and ambition in equal measure. It was a place where steel clanged, trains rattled, and the streets echoed with the languages of a dozen different homelands. Among the crowded neighborhoods of the West Side, where pushcarts lined the streets and children darted between horse-drawn wagons, a boy named Salvatore Giancana was born. His parents had come from Sicily, bringing with them little more than their faith, their recipes, and the hope that hard work might buy them a piece of the American dream. But the dream in Chicago was not given. It was clawed from brick and soot. The family settled into a cramped flat where walls sweated in summer and rattled with the winter wind. His father worked long hours as a pushcart grocer, pushing produce through streets filled with shouting vendors and the smell of coal smoke. His mother tended to the children, her voice thick with Sicilian lullabies and her hands worn from endless cooking and mending. For Salvatore, the world outside their door offered lessons that no school would ever teach. The streets taught survival. Boys fought with fists before they learned how to write their names. Alleyways were classrooms where you discovered who you could trust and how quickly loyalty could change with the flick of a coin. The neighborhood was tough, stitched together by poverty and pride, where everyone's eyes seemed sharper than their words. The Irish had their blocks, the Poles had theirs, and the Italians carved out corners of their own. In between were saloons, gambling dens, and whispers of men who carried power not through politics, but through fear. Little Salvatore, who would one day shorten his name to Sam, grew up listening to those whispers. He watched older boys run errands for men in dark suits, saw how a gesture could silence a room, how a name alone could buy respect. Respect mattered more than money here, though money was never far behind. He was small, wiry, with a restless energy that made him seem older than his years. His temper flared fast, earning him both bruises and a kind of rough admiration. By the time most children were still tethered to their mother's skirts, Sam was roaming blocks on his own, eyes sharp, ears always open. He learned to read the rhythm of the streets, the shuffle of a drunk's shoes, the sudden quiet before a fight, the laughter that followed a deal made in shadows. He was a boy born into struggle, but one who studied it as if struggle were a language meant only for him. In that immigrant neighborhood, where every corner carried both danger and opportunity, Sam Giancana began to understand something that would guide him all his life. Power did not live in the rules written on paper. It lived in the glances exchanged across smoky saloons, in the nods given on sidewalks, in the quiet acknowledgement of who was owed and who was feared. It was there, in those soot-stained streets of Chicago, that a gangster's heart first began to beat. On Chicago's West Side, life moved to a rhythm set by the immigrant heartbeat. The Italians carried their homeland with them, not in suitcases but in rituals, in food simmering on stoves, in the way neighbors looked after one another, even when they had little themselves. On Sundays, the streets filled with the smell of garlic and fresh bread, with children darting past church steps, their voices tangled with the toll of the bells. Family was not just blood, it was survival, and everyone in the neighborhood knew where the lines were drawn. The code was simple but unbreakable. You honored your parents, you defended your friends, you never betrayed the trust of the block. Outsiders were tolerated, but only just. The Irish patrolled their corners, the Polish their markets, and the Italians their alleyways. To live among them was to understand that every glance carried weight, every silence carried meaning. A boy learned early that respect was earned in the smallest gestures, carrying groceries for an elder, kissing the hand of a priest, standing up for your brother in a schoolyard fight. Sam Giancana grew up inside this unwritten law. He saw how the men gathered at corner cafes, espresso cups rattling on saucers, voices low but commanding. They spoke of business as if it were smoke that could drift through the neighborhood unseen but never unnoticed. Children were shooed away, but they always lingered near enough to hear. And young Sam, restless and sharp, listened harder than most. He began to understand that in their code, loyalty was currency, and silence was the shield that guarded it. The community demanded pride, too. No matter how poor the family, shirts were pressed for mass, shoes shined before school. A stain on the family name was worse than an empty stomach. Mothers reminded their sons that every action reflected on the whole house, the whole bloodline. Fathers enforced it with belts and fists if they had to, because the neighborhood had no patience for weakness. Reputation was armor, and once cracked, it was nearly impossible to mend. But behind the warmth of communal dinners and wedding feasts, behind the songs carried across stoops on summer nights, there was another layer, a darker one. It was the quiet understanding that certain men could make problems disappear. A stolen cart returned, a bully silenced, a debt forgiven if the right hands were kissed. The church preached heaven, but the streets whispered of men who carried power in their pockets, men whose names were spoken carefully, as though they were prayers or curses. Sam absorbed it all, the laughter, the discipline, the loyalty, and the fear. He learned that in this world, to belong was everything, but to rise above belonging, to be the man others pointed to with either reverence or dread, that was the true prize. The neighborhood code was never written down, but it was carved deep into him, as permanent as the soot on the brick walls of Chicago's West Side. Trouble found Sam Giancana early, or maybe it was the other way around. On the West Side streets, mischief was the first currency a boy could spend. Before he was tall enough to look a shopkeeper in the eye, Sam was already running errands that carried more risk than reward. He started with small things, lifting apples from push carts, sneaking bottles from delivery trucks, flipping coins in alleys where every toss felt like a wager against the future. What others saw as petty crime, Sam treated like lessons. Each scrape was a test, each narrow escape a mark of growing skill. The police knew his name before he was out of his teens. They caught him loitering near stores that had been robbed, suspected him of fights that ended with broken noses and hospital beds. Most times, there wasn't enough proof to hold him. The neighborhood code worked in his favor. Shopkeepers looked the other way. Witnesses forgot what they had seen, and parents shielded their children from the questions of uniformed men. Sam learned that silence was more powerful than fists. A secret kept could be more dangerous than a knife. His reputation spread among other boys who craved the same rush. Together, they formed little packs, prowling streets after dusk, eyes sharp for opportunity. They broke into garages, lifted radios, stripped tires, anything they could sell for quick money. The rush was addictive. It wasn't just about what they stole, it was about the thrill of running, the echo of footsteps in the dark, the satisfaction of slipping through cracks the law couldn't seal. Sam had a knack for leading. Even then, his temper flared fast, but his instincts were sharper. He could sense when to push, when to wait, when to vanish into the night before the trap was sprung. The arrests came anyway. A night in a cell, the stink of sweat and stale air, the clank of iron bars closing. For most boys, it was enough to scare them straight. For Sam, it was a different kind of education. He learned how men inside carried themselves, how respect was negotiated even in a cage. He listened more than he spoke, storing away names, gestures, the way power shifted in a room. When he walked free again, he wasn't humbled, he was hardened. The older men on the block began to notice. They saw a boy who didn't crack under pressure, who kept his mouth shut when questioned, who wore his bruises like badges. That was worth more than anything he could steal. In the eyes of the neighborhood, Sam was no longer just another restless kid. He was a prospect, a name whispered with the beginnings of respect. And while most of his friends would fade back into obscurity, Sam Giancana was already stepping into the shadow of something larger. Petty crime was never the destination, it was only the doorway he had to kick down. By the time Sam Giancana was old enough to shave, his name was already drifting through the alleys of Chicago with a kind of dangerous promise. He had moved beyond stealing apples and tires, beyond the childish thrill of running from beat cops. The next step waited for him in the form of a group that everyone on the West Side knew, a crew that turned restless boys into hardened men. They called themselves the 42 Gang, and even the way the name rolled off tongues carried weight. To some, they were just kids with too much time and too little fear. To others, they were a factory of future killers, a farm team for the outfit itself. The 42 Gang was not a playground clique. It was a proving ground. Membership meant loyalty, meant stepping into a world where the line between survival and ambition blurred into blood. They had a reputation for theft, for hijackings, for running protection rackets that squeezed coins from shopkeepers too scared to refuse. But it wasn't the crimes themselves that gave them their edge. It was the way they carried them out. With precision, with ferocity, with no hesitation. Violence was their calling card, and in the neighborhoods of Chicago, people learned to respect the calling card. Sam fit in like a match dropped into dry tinder. His temper, his sharp instincts, his willingness to swing first and ask later, these were not flaws here. They were virtues. Within the gang, he found a mirror of himself in the faces of other boys who craved the same thing: power, respect, the feeling of walking down a street and knowing people crossed to the other side. They became his brothers, bound not by blood but by risk, by nights spent running jobs, by mornings spent counting stolen goods in hidden basements that smelled of dust and sweat. Cops hated the 42 Gang, but even more than that, they feared them. Arrests rarely stuck, witnesses melted away, juries turned soft. For the outfit, the larger machine of organized crime that ruled Chicago, the gang was a kind of audition stage. They watched these boys carefully, looking for the ones who could take orders without cracking, who could keep their mouths shut in a holding cell, who could shed blood without hesitation. And Sam, reckless yet disciplined in strange ways, stood out. Stories began to circulate: how he'd stood his ground in a knife fight, how he'd driven a stolen car through police barricades, how he'd laughed when an officer tried to scare him with threats of reform school. That laugh stuck with people. It was not bravado, it was something colder, something that said he already knew the rules of this game, and he wasn't afraid to play them to the end. The 42 Gang was supposed to chew boys up and spit them out, but for Sam Giancana, it was different. The gang didn't consume him, it refined him. It sharpened the edges, hardened the core, and revealed a figure ready to step out of the shadows of petty crime and into the spotlight of Chicago's underworld. What began as a youth gang became his crucible, and out of that crucible, a future mob boss was forged. Chicago, in the era of Prohibition, was a city soaked in contradictions. The law said no, but the streets said yes, and in between was where fortunes were made. Speakeasies glowed behind unmarked doors, bottles clinked in the dark of back rooms, and trucks heavy with liquor rolled through alleys under the cover of night. For Sam Giancana, still young but already hardened by the 42 Gang, this was not just chaos, it was a classroom. The city itself became his teacher, and crime was the curriculum. Bootlegging was the foundation. Whiskey from Canada, rum from the Caribbean, home brews mixed in hidden basements. It all needed hands to move it, muscle to guard it, and brains to sell it. Sam learned fast that the real money wasn't in the bottles themselves, but in the roots, the logistics, the men who knew how to make a shipment vanish past police checkpoints with a smile or a bribe. He ran errands at first, carrying messages, delivering envelopes, riding shotgun on trucks that rattled with contraband. But he watched, always watched, memorizing how the older men greased palms, how they chose which cops to pay, which ones to threaten, and which ones to let taste the liquor so they'd remember whose product flowed smoother. From liquor, he drifted into numbers. The policy racket was the heartbeat of the neighborhoods, A poor man's lottery played with hope and desperation. Housewives bet pennies, laborers dropped nickels, and those small wagers grew into rivers of cash. Sam took collections, counted slips, ran them back to the men who managed the odds. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, and it taught him that crime was not just about fear, it was about trust. People handed over their coins not because they loved the mob, but because the mob kept the game alive when the government would not. In that contradiction lay power, and Sam absorbed it like scripture. Then came the protection rackets. Shopkeepers with narrow margins and wide eyes learned quickly that paying a small weekly fee kept their windows intact and their families safe. Sam was one of the boys who walked the streets collecting those fees. Sometimes it was just words, a smile paired with a hand on the counter. Other times it was fists through glass or boots against ribs to remind the hesitant. He never needed to be told twice. Violence was a language he already spoke fluently, and with each job, he became more fluent still. By the time Prohibition neared its end, Sam Giancana was no longer a boy fumbling in alleyways. He was a young man who had learned the rhythms of an empire built on defiance. Bootlegging taught him logistics. Numbers taught him loyalty. Protection taught him fear's true currency. In the shadows of Prohibition Chicago, where the law was just another player to be bribed or beaten, Sam Giancana was not simply surviving. He was rehearsing for the empire he would one day command. Violence was never abstract to Sam Giancana. It was the language of the streets, and the men who survived longest were the ones who spoke it with fluency. In Chicago's underworld, fists and bullets were punctuation marks, and Sam's education came not from books, but from the older gangsters who took an interest in sharpening him into something useful. They didn't teach with words. They taught with scars. There was the night he rode along with an older outfit soldier, a man with a jaw like stone and eyes that never seemed to blink. They drove to a tavern on the south side, a place where an owner had refused to pay protection money. Sam sat quiet in the passenger seat, hands folded, trying to hide the tremor in his fingers. Inside, the soldier ordered a drink, took 2 sips, and then smashed the glass against the counter. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't explain himself. He simply leaned close to the owner, spoke a few words Sam couldn't quite hear, and then drew his pistol with a speed that seemed almost casual. The shot echoed, the body crumpled, and the bar went silent except for the drip of liquid on the floor. They left without hurry. In the car, the soldier finally spoke. "That's how you teach respect." Sam never forgot the calm in his tone. Another lesson came from a different mentor, a man who had once worked as muscle for Al Capone himself. He taught Sam about patience, about the value of waiting until anger cooled into calculation. "Hot blood gets you dead," he warned, tapping his chest with a finger thick as a club. "Cold blood keeps you alive." Sam tested this advice one night when a rival gang cornered him in an alley, knives flashing. Instead of rushing, he stepped back, studied the angles, and struck when they overreached. He walked away with cuts on his arms, but a new respect from the men who saw him keep his head while others lost theirs. Every encounter with these older gangsters carried the same lesson. Violence was not just brutality, it was strategy. Sometimes it was swift and loud, a warning to everyone watching. Other times it was quiet, drawn out, meant for the victim alone. Sam learned when to snarl and when to smile, when a slap across the face could do more damage than a bullet in the chest. He learned that fear lingered longer than pain. By the time he reached his 20s, Sam carried himself differently. His fists were steady, his voice measured, his eyes harder. He no longer reacted out of impulse, he chose his moments. The older gangsters who had shaped him saw it too. They had given him the brutal mentorship of survival, and in return, Sam Giancana became not just another tough kid from the 42 gang, but a man the outfit could begin to trust with bigger responsibilities. He had been mentored by violence, and now he was fluent enough to teach the lesson himself. Every gangster has a moment when the line between reputation and reality is crossed, when whispers turn into certainty. For Sam Giancana, that moment came in the form of blood. Until then, he had been a rising figure, a boy from the 42 gang who showed nerve and cunning, someone older men in the outfit were beginning to notice. But in the Chicago underworld, notice was never enough. To be trusted with power, you had to prove you could deliver death without flinching. The story passed through the neighborhoods in fragments, half-truths stitched together by fear and fascination. A rival crew had been pressing into territory that wasn't theirs, skimming from gambling games and leaning too heavily on shopkeepers already paying tribute to the outfit. It was more than an insult, it was a challenge, and the bosses needed someone to answer it. Sam was given the job, not because he was the most experienced, but because he had something to prove. They wanted to see if the boy with the quick temper and sharp eyes could handle real business. The night came cold and damp, the kind of night when alleys smelled of smoke and rainwater. Sam waited with 2 other men in the back of a sedan, the engine ticking softly. His heart hammered, not from fear exactly, but from the electric charge of what he was about to do. In his pocket was a pistol, its weight heavier than anything he had carried before. He had been in fights, had seen knives flash, had heard the crack of gunfire in the distance, but this was different. This time the trigger belonged to him. The rival stepped out of a corner tavern, laughter spilling behind him with the swing of the door. Sam moved before he could think, the way instinct takes over when hesitation would kill you. The gun came up, the shots rang out, sharp and final. The man collapsed onto the wet pavement, his laughter snuffed into a gurgle. Sam didn't linger. He slid back into the car, the others already pulling him inside, the tires screaming as they peeled away into the night. Back in the neighborhood, the effect was immediate. Word spread that Mooney, his temper had earned him that nickname, had handled his first real piece of work. Men who had dismissed him as another reckless kid now looked at him differently. He had crossed the line, stepped into the circle of those who could be counted on to carry out orders with lethal precision. There was no going back from that. Sam never spoke of it much, not to family, not to friends, not even to those who had sent him. But the lesson was etched into him as clearly as the scars he already carried. Violence was no longer just survival or theater. It was business, and in Chicago's underworld, business was the only language that mattered. His first blood was not the end of innocence, it was the beginning of power. For Sam Giancana, prison came early, like a rite of passage stamped into his story before he was even a man. Chicago's streets had already taught him about survival, about the value of silence and the price of loyalty. But the bars of a cell delivered an education no alleyway could provide. It was not just punishment, it was initiation. The first time he was booked, he was little more than a teenager with a record of petty crimes and a reputation for being quick with his fists. The cell smelled of sweat and iron, of despair thick enough to taste. For most boys, the fear of confinement would have been enough to steer them straight. But Sam wasn't most boys. Where others trembled, he observed. He noticed who commanded the room, who got the better portion of bread at mealtime, who could make another man step aside with just a glance. Even locked up, the hierarchy of the streets lived on, and he studied it like scripture. Days bled into weeks, and in those stretches of time, he learned the discipline of waiting. Prison life moved at a crawl. Each hour felt longer than the last, but within that slowness was a strange kind of focus. Sam learned to bide his time, to let impatience cool into calculation. He practiced silence, speaking only when necessary, never revealing more than he intended. The men around him noticed. He wasn't just another restless kid bouncing off the walls. He carried himself like someone preparing for a future beyond the cell. The guards tried to break him with routine, but routine only sharpened him. He woke with the clang of the morning bell, ate the bland food without complaint, did the work assigned without protest. But behind his calm exterior, his mind kept racing, planning, absorbing. He learned who could be bribed, who could be intimidated, and how even the smallest privileges, an extra cigarette, a lighter duty, were tokens of power to be traded like currency. It was in prison that Sam came to understand something vital. Violence earned respect, but discipline sustained it. To rule men, you had to control not just your enemies but yourself. Rage could spark fear, but patience built influence. He watched older gangsters move like chess players, never wasting a piece, never showing desperation. He mirrored them, imitating the posture of calm even when his blood ran hot. When he finally walked free again, the city had not changed, but Sam had. The boy who had gone in hot-headed and reckless came out colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. Prison had not reformed him, it had refined him. The law had meant to cage him, but what it really did was forge him into a man who understood the deeper truth of power. It exists everywhere, even in chains, if you know how to claim it. When the ban on alcohol finally crumbled in 1933, Chicago exhaled in relief. Bars reopened their doors, breweries lit their kettles, and the city flowed with whiskey and beer that no longer had to hide in shadows. For most, repeal meant celebration. For gangsters like Sam Giancana, it meant something else entirely: reinvention. The rivers of money that had once come from bootlegging dried up overnight. The men who had built empires on hidden bottles now faced a question that could not be dodged. Where would the next fortune come from? Sam was young, but he was no fool. He saw older gangsters scrambling, some desperate, some defeated, as their bootlegging networks dissolved into the hands of legitimate businesses. Trucks that once carried contraband were sold off, speakeasies rebranded as licensed taverns, and police officers who had fattened themselves on bribes suddenly looked elsewhere for income. The entire ecosystem shifted, and only the sharpest survived. Sam had no intention of being left behind. The outfit moved quickly. Where one door closed, they forced open another. Gambling became the new heartbeat of the underworld. Policy wheels spun in back rooms, horse bets flowed through smoky bars, and dice clattered across tables where the house always won. Sam had already cut his teeth in the numbers racket, but now he watched it expand into something larger, more organized, more profitable. The coins of working men and women poured upward, climbing the ladder of the outfit until they became stacks of bills that bankrolled empires. Prostitution remained steady, an old vice that never waned, but it was gambling that excited the young Giancana. Numbers were not messy like booze or bodies. They were clean, predictable, mathematical. With the right structure, the racket ran like a machine, and Sam was a man who understood machines. He stepped deeper into that world, collecting bets, enforcing debts, and carving his reputation as someone who made the wheel spin smoothly until it didn't. Then the fists came out, and the machine fixed itself in blood. Labor racketeering rose alongside gambling. Unions were growing, powerful, and vulnerable to corruption. The outfit slid into their ranks with bribes and muscle, taking slices from contracts, construction sites, and entire industries. Sam began to see that power wasn't just about controlling streets, it was about controlling systems. A rigged contract could bring in more money than a hijacked truck ever had, and the men pulling strings never had to leave their chairs. That realization lit something in him. Violence was necessary, but influence, that was where empires lived. So while the city cheered its legal drinks, Sam Giancana and the outfit built new empires in the spaces law forgot to protect. Prohibition's end was not their downfall, it was their rebirth. For Sam, it was proof of a truth he would carry for the rest of his life. In every ending, there was opportunity, and the sharpest men were the ones who knew how to turn loss into power. Nicknames in the underworld were more than jokes. They were reputations carved into a single word, a label that stuck like tar whether a man liked it or not. For Sam Giancana, that word was Mooney. It was first whispered behind his back, then thrown at him in the middle of heated arguments, until eventually it became the name that followed him everywhere. It was born from his temper, the kind of sudden fury that could flip a room from laughter to silence in a heartbeat. To some, He looked half crazy when rage lit his eyes, and so they called him Mooney, short for moonstruck, as if the moon itself had tilted him off balance. Sam pretended to hate it, snapping at men who used it too casually, but deep down he understood what it meant. A nickname like Mooney was not just an insult, it was a warning. It told the world that he was volatile, unpredictable, a man whose fuse burned too quickly to measure. In Chicago's streets, unpredictability could be as valuable as muscle. No one wanted to test how far he might go once his temper ignited. Fear traveled faster than fists, and Sam learned to let that fear work for him. The paranoia came later, as the stakes grew higher and the shadows seemed thicker. Even as a young man, Sam had a habit of watching doorways twice, of pausing before he stepped into the open, of suspecting betrayal, even in smiles. Some called it madness, others called it survival. In truth, it was both. Chicago was a city where a friend could shake your hand in the morning and plan your funeral by nightfall. Trust was a currency more fragile than glass. Sam kept his circle small, his eyes sharper than most, and his temper ready to explode when suspicion grew too loud to ignore. Men inside the outfit joked about his moods, but they also respected them. They knew that under the bursts of anger was a cunning instinct. He might yell, slam his fist on a table, curse until his throat was raw, but once the fire cooled, he saw things others had missed. He remembered every slight, every whispered threat, every shadow that lingered too long outside a window. The paranoia that made him seem unstable was the same paranoia that kept him alive, and so the name Mooney followed him. From the alleys of his youth to the smoke-filled rooms where men planned million-dollar schemes, it clung to him like a second skin, half mocking, half menacing, impossible to shake. He never chose it, but he grew into it, just as he had grown into the violence and the silence of the streets. To his enemies, Mooney was a curse. To his friends, it was a reminder. And to Sam himself, it was a mask, one that hid both the fury and the fear of a man who knew that in his world, madness might be the only sane way to live. By the time Sam Giancana reached his 20s, the 42 gang was no longer enough. The scrapes and heists of youth had been stepping stones, but the real power in Chicago rested with the outfit. The empire once ruled by Al Capone and now carried forward by Frank Nitti. To work for the outfit was to graduate from street brawls and backroom rackets into a world where fortunes were counted in stacks of bills and decisions were made in whispers that could topple entire industries. Frank Nitti, known as the Enforcer, had none of Capone's flamboyance. He preferred quiet control, building networks that reached into unions, politics, and business deals that looked legitimate on paper. But behind that calm exterior, he needed men who were ruthless enough to keep order. Sam, with his sharp instincts, his quick temper, and his proven willingness to shed blood, was exactly the kind of man the outfit could use. His first jobs under Nitti were small but telling, collecting debts, protecting shipments, making sure certain contracts went the right way. He learned that the outfit was not just about brute force, it was about systems, about keeping the machine running smoothly, so money never stopped flowing. Sam proved himself reliable, efficient, and most importantly, silent. In a world where one loose tongue could sink an empire, his refusal to speak outside the circle made him valuable. Nitti's men noticed that he had more than muscle. He had vision. While others were content with envelopes of cash and nights spent in smoke-filled bars, Sam's mind reached further. He studied how money moved, how bribes softened judges, how politicians could be bought cheaper than bullets if you knew which ones to approach. He wasn't content with being just another soldier. He wanted to shape the game. Still, violence remained part of his work. If a man failed to pay, Sam made sure the lesson was unforgettable. If a rival crew pushed too far, he was sent to remind them of boundaries. His reputation as Mooney grew in these years not just as a hothead, but as a man whose madness could be turned on and off like a switch. Allies learned to respect him. Enemies learned to fear him. Both were useful. Working for the outfit was more than a job. It was a transformation. He was no longer a boy from the West Side or just a member of the 42 gang. He was now part of the backbone of Chicago's criminal empire, moving in the shadows of Frank Nitty's reign. Every task completed, every order followed, pulled him deeper into the heart of the outfit. And in that heart, Sam Giancana began to see the shape of the man he would become, a boss in waiting, already learning that power was not inherited. It was earned, step by bloody step. The end of Prohibition had forced the outfit to reinvent itself, and out of that reinvention came a new empire built not on liquor but on luck. Gambling was everywhere in Chicago, not just in smoky back rooms or behind velvet curtains, but in the pockets and purses of ordinary people who played the numbers every day. The policy racket was the poor man's lottery, a dream bought with pennies, nickels, and dimes. Housewives picked numbers based on birthdays. Cab drivers wagered on license plates. Children even ran slips for pocket change. It was illegal, yes, but it was also irresistible. And in that irresistible current, Sam Giancana found his calling. The numbers racket was deceptively simple. Players chose a combination, placed their bets, and hoped fortune favored them. Behind that simplicity, though, was a machine of staggering complexity. Money had to be collected across entire neighborhoods, slips tabulated, winnings calculated, odds balanced, so the house always came out ahead. It was an empire of paper and ink, run on trust, speed, and the constant hum of human desperation. For most men, it was chaos. For Sam, it was music. He took to the racket with the precision of a mathematician and the ruthlessness of a street fighter. Collections ran smoother under his watch. He knew which runners were trustworthy, which ones skimmed, which ones might crack under pressure. He balanced generosity and fear with equal measure, paying winners promptly to keep faith alive, punishing cheaters swiftly to keep order intact. Every coin, every slip, was a piece of a puzzle he controlled. What set Sam apart was not just efficiency, but vision. He saw the racket as more than petty gambling. It was community currency. People weren't just playing for money. They were playing for hope, for distraction from long hours and empty pockets. He understood that to control the numbers game was to control the heartbeat of the neighborhoods. Respect didn't come only from fear. It came from being the man who kept the wheel turning, the man who could make a poor woman's dream come true with a payout that meant rent for the month. The outfit noticed. The bosses knew that whoever mastered the numbers could command rivers of cash that flowed steadily, quietly, and endlessly. Under Sam's stewardship, those rivers swelled. He introduced order where there had been chaos, streamlined collections, expanded the reach of the game into corners of the city once thought too small to matter. In the process, he carved out a reputation as a man who could turn pennies into fortunes, not just for himself, but for the outfit. These years marked the golden age of gambling in Chicago, when numbers slips fluttered like secret prayers through tenement hallways, and every coin flipped into the racket found its way back to the outfit's pockets. For Sam Giancana, it was not merely profit, it was power. And with every wager placed, with every desperate hand extended, his grip on the city grew tighter. The golden age of gambling was his crucible, and in it, he forged the empire that would make him more than a soldier, it would make him indispensable. Chicago's underworld never stayed still. Power was always shifting, men rising and falling like dice thrown across a table, and each roll was stained with blood. After Al Capone's empire fractured under prison walls, the outfit became something more dangerous, quieter, sharper, less theatrical. Men in suits replaced men with cigars, but the cost of control was still measured in bodies. Sam Giancana came of age inside this storm, watching closely as the outfit's silent wars shaped the future he was climbing toward. Frank Nitti had inherited the throne, but his reign was far from secure. The outfit was less a family than a collection of factions bound together by money and fear. Each faction had its own loyalties, its own soldiers, and its own ambitions. Betrayal was not a possibility. It was an inevitability. Men whispered in restaurants, met in parked cars, and disappeared in alleys. One week, a capo was celebrated at a wedding. The next, his body was found in the trunk of a sedan, jaw wired shut, eyes wide with whatever he had seen before the end. Sam learned early that leadership was not about titles, but about survival. He watched as men rose quickly, intoxicated by power, only to be cut down when they reached too high. Some were betrayed by friends they had trusted for years. Others were undone by their own arrogance, flaunting wealth or women in ways that drew too much attention. The newspapers reported gangland slayings, as if they were routine, but for Sam, each one was a lesson written in blood. The murders were brutal, but the betrayals cut deeper. A handshake one night could mean a bullet the next morning. Alliances shifted like smoke, impossible to grasp. Sam grew paranoid, but that paranoia kept him alive. He never sat with his back to a door. He studied faces for signs of hesitation. He understood that silence was not just loyalty, it was strategy. To speak too much was to invite death. To know too much was to sign your own execution order. Through it all, he carved out his reputation as someone who could be trusted to carry out orders without hesitation. His willingness to get his hands dirty, paired with his ability to keep his mouth shut, made him invaluable in a world where both qualities were rare. When the outfit's leadership faltered, Sam remained steady, proving himself again and again in the quiet wars that reshaped the empire. By the end of those years, he was no longer just another soldier in the outfit. He was a survivor of battles fought in whispers and settled with gunfire, a man tempered by the knowledge that power was never permanent, only borrowed until someone stronger or more ruthless came to take it. In Chicago's silent wars, survival was the only victory, and Sam Giancana was learning how to win it. Sam Giancana had built his early reputation with fists, pistols, and the kind of rage that made men step aside before he even spoke. But as the years moved forward, he began to understand that raw violence could only take him so far. Chicago was not ruled by brawlers anymore. It was ruled by men who knew how to turn chaos into systems, who could make bloodshed the exception rather than the rule. Sam studied them, and then he surpassed them. He became something rare in the underworld, a technocrat of crime, a man who saw rackets not just as hustles, but as machines to be perfected. Where others relied on muscle, Sam leaned on order. He analyzed the numbers racket the way an engineer might study a blueprint. Every bet, every collection, every payout was measured, streamlined, and disciplined. He eliminated waste, cut out skimmers, and ensured profits moved upward with precision. He understood that chaos drained money, while structure multiplied it. Soon, the cash flowing under his control was steadier, cleaner, and larger than anything the outfit had seen from men twice his age. Strategy became his weapon. Instead of sending gunmen into every conflict, he chose where to apply pressure. Some debts were forgiven to build loyalty. Some rivals were absorbed rather than eliminated. He realized that violence was most effective when it was rare, when it was remembered because it was swift and merciless, not constant and sloppy. Fear, he discovered, did not come from endless brutality, but from the knowledge that when it arrived, it would be absolute. Sam also had a gift for building networks. He saw opportunity in unions, in contracts, in legitimate businesses that could be bent to serve illegitimate ends. He studied which politicians were vulnerable, which police captains had debts, which businessmen could be enticed with a taste of easy profit. Instead of treating corruption as a one-time bribe, he turned it into a system of investment. A politician on his payroll was not just a shield but a tool, capable of opening doors that fists could never break down. This strategic mind set him apart from the hotheads and the muscle-bound enforcers who had once been his peers. He still carried the nickname Mooney, still erupted with volcanic temper when pushed, but behind that fury was calculation. He cultivated an image of unpredictability, while behind closed doors he operated with methodical precision. Men underestimated him at their peril, mistaking madness for chaos when in truth it was camouflage for design. By the time his reputation solidified, Sam Giancana was no longer simply feared as a gangster. He was respected as an organizer, a man who could transform rackets into engines of wealth. Strategy had become his sharpest blade, and in a world where most men ruled only until their luck ran out, Sam was building something stronger than luck. He was building a system that could outlive bullets. Las Vegas was a desert dream built on neon and lies, a place where fortunes could appear overnight under the glow of a roulette wheel. To the tourists, it looked like magic. To the outfit, it looked like opportunity. When Chicago's grip on gambling tightened in the 30s and 40s, the bosses saw Nevada as fresh soil ready for planting. The state had legalized casinos, but the men who ran them lacked muscle, capital, and the discipline to keep profits steady. That was where Sam Giancana and the outfit entered the picture. Chicago money flowed into Vegas like water down a dry arroyo. Loans were extended to struggling casinos, often under terms that left the houses tied by invisible chains. The outfit financed construction, bought hidden shares, and placed their own men in key positions. On the surface, the casinos glittered with glamour showgirls, crooners, and high-rolling tourists. Behind the curtain, skim operations thrived. A percentage of profits, carefully siphoned before taxes or official counts, was shipped back to Chicago in suitcases and envelopes. Sam understood the brilliance of it. No more back-alley policy wheels or makeshift betting parlors. Vegas was gambling in daylight, dressed up as entertainment. The money was clean to the tourists and dirty to the accountants. Every chip played on a table was another coin feeding Chicago's empire. He had seen the numbers rackets pull in steady streams of cash, but Vegas was a flood, limitless and legal on its surface. Giancana's role was not just as an investor but as an enforcer of order. He made sure the streams of cash flowed where they were supposed to. He dealt with skimmers who got too greedy, casino managers who forgot who their silent partners were, and unions that suddenly thought they could challenge outfit control. Vegas might have been far from Chicago in miles, but it was an extension of the same rules: loyalty, silence, and the absolute certainty that betrayal was fatal. The connections spread beyond money. Vegas became a meeting ground, neutral territory where mobsters from Chicago, New York, Cleveland, and Kansas City crossed paths. Deals were struck in suites above casino floors. Fortunes decided over cocktails while entertainers sang below. Sam thrived in that world. He liked the flash of the desert city, the illusion of legitimacy. He could walk through a casino lobby and appear to be just another businessman, while in truth, he was one of the architects holding the whole glittering facade in place. Through Las Vegas, the outfit transformed itself. It was no longer just a collection of street rackets and union scams. It was a financial empire with ties stretching from Chicago's west side to the Nevada desert. And Giancana, with his strategic mind and iron will, became one of the key men, ensuring that the desert dream never stopped feeding Chicago's hunger. Vegas was not just casinos and lights. It was the outfit's golden goose, and Sam knew exactly how to keep it alive. In Chicago, the line between law and crime was never a wall. It was a curtain, thin and easy to slip behind if you had the money and the muscle. Sam Giancana understood this better than most. Guns could silence a rival, fists could collect a debt, but to build something lasting, you needed protection from above. That meant politicians, judges, and cops, and in Sam's world, all of them had a price. The outfit had long perfected the art of greasing palms. A wad of cash slipped into the right pocket could turn a courtroom from hostile to forgiving. Police raids could be delayed or canceled altogether with the quiet promise of envelopes passed under tables. Election nights became less about ballots and more about deals struck in back rooms where smoke curled and hands shook. Giancana, sharp and observant, knew this game and played it with precision. He didn't just buy men, he cultivated them. A politician on the rise might receive campaign contributions, the kind of money that looked clean on paper but carried invisible strings. A judge struggling with debts might find them mysteriously resolved, only to discover later that his rulings were expected to bend in certain directions. Beat cops were treated differently. Free meals, envelopes of cash at Christmas, the promise of security for their families. In return, doors opened and eyes looked the other way. Sam was careful. He never treated corruption as charity. It was an investment, one that had to pay back more than it cost. He kept lists in his head of who owed him, who could be trusted, and who might need a reminder of where their loyalty lay. Fear reinforced the money. A politician who thought he could take the cash and walk away soon discovered that walking away from the outfit was more dangerous than standing by their side. Over time, his reach grew. City council members, aldermen, judges in criminal courts, all of them quietly tied to the outfit. Police captains became allies, ensuring that investigations fizzled out, evidence disappeared, and witnesses suddenly lost their voices. The system was not broken, it was bought, and Sam was one of its shrewdest shareholders. What made him dangerous was not just the size of his payroll, but the way he understood power. He knew that the true bosses of Chicago wore robes and suits, not fedoras. They stood in city halls, courthouses, and precincts. By placing them in his pocket, he was not just protecting himself, he was shaping the city. For Giancana, friends in high places were more than insurance. They were the pillars of his empire. Every dollar spent on them was worth 10 earned in the streets. With judges, politicians, and cops on his side, Sam Giancana could move like a ghost through Chicago. Untouchable, unstoppable. A man who had learned that true power was not about breaking laws, but about owning the men who enforced them. For all the nights spent in smoke-filled rooms, for all the whispers of murder and money that surrounded his name, Sam Giancana still tried to wear the mask of a family man. He married young, brought children into the world, and filled a house with the appearance of normalcy. To neighbors, he was a husband and father. To churchgoers, he was another face in the pew. It was the illusion he needed, a shield against suspicion, the suggestion that beneath the headlines and the whispers was a man who wanted nothing more than what every other working immigrant wanted: a safe home and a legacy for his children. The truth was less simple. Sam's life outside the house bled into it. His temper, the same fire that made him feared on the streets, sometimes crackled inside the walls meant to hold peace. He carried the paranoia of the underworld with him, checking locks twice, pulling curtains closed, teaching his family the unspoken rules of silence. His wife endured it, as many mob wives did, walking the thin line between loyalty and fear, knowing that love was not enough to shield them from the shadows that followed him. The children grew up in a world both privileged and fragile. They had fine clothes, cars, and the kind of gifts other families could only dream of. But all of it came at a cost. They lived under a constant tension, the awareness that every phone call, every knock at the door, might not be ordinary. They knew their father's name was both protection and danger, blessing and curse. At school, whispers followed them, half in awe and half in warning. Sam clung to the illusion, perhaps even convincing himself at times that he could balance it all. He would sit at the dinner table, share meals, laugh with his children, and for a moment look like any other man who had fought his way out of poverty to provide for his family. Yet the phone would ring, or a car would idle too long outside, and the mask would slip. The underworld was always calling, and he could never leave it waiting. To outsiders, photographs of him with his family painted a picture of a devoted father. To insiders, it was understood as another layer of camouflage. The outfit respected family life but never believed in it as sanctuary. Wives and children were part of the story, but they were not the story itself. Sam knew that. He knew the mask mattered less for him than for the city watching. for the authorities who still wanted to believe he might be one of the men they could leave alone. The family man illusion was never about truth. It was about survival. In a city that measured loyalty in silence and power in fear, the home was less a refuge than another stage. And Sam Giancana played his role well, smiling at neighbors while carrying the weight of an empire that could never fit inside the walls of a single house. By the mid-1940s, Sam Giancana had already proven himself as more than just another soldier in the outfit. He had mastered the numbers game, kept the cash flowing steady, and shown that his temper, however dangerous, could be matched by discipline and calculation. Men whispered his name not only in fear but in respect. He was no longer simply Mooney, the hothead from the West Side. He was a man the outfit could not afford to ignore. The first step upward was consigliere, the trusted counselor. In that role, Sam learned the weight of influence over men who were older, richer, and in many cases, more seasoned. He was not just enforcing rules anymore, he was helping to write them. His advice mattered, his voice carried. Decisions about contracts, rackets, and even life and death began to pass through him. He understood the politics of the underworld, how to balance factions, how to soothe old grudges while sharpening new alliances. The consigliere was not always the loudest man in the room, but he was often the most dangerous, because his hand guided the table itself. Sam thrived in that role, but ambition never let him stop. He wanted the chair at the head of the table. The outfit, though, did not hand out thrones lightly. To become boss meant more than cunning. It meant surviving the constant shuffle of power, the betrayals, the purges, the assassinations that thinned the herd. Sam survived them all. He had watched others fall in the silent wars, had seen what arrogance or carelessness could do, and he avoided their mistakes. He kept his circle tight, his movements careful, his enemies close enough to study but never close enough to strike first. When the time finally came, the transition was less a coronation than a quiet inevitability. Men who had doubted him now found themselves looking to him for leadership. He had proven he could handle money, politics, and blood with equal steadiness. He could move between the smoky backrooms of Chicago taverns and the glittering neon of Las Vegas without missing a beat. He was the man who could keep the machine running. As boss, Sam Giancana consolidated power with the same cold efficiency he had once brought to the numbers racket. He expanded the outfit's reach into labor unions, into casinos, into international ventures that blurred the line between crime and politics. He was ruthless when necessary, patient when it counted, and paranoid enough to never believe his seat was truly secure. From consigliere to boss, his rise was not marked by a single violent act or sudden coup. It was marked by calculation, by the slow tightening of his grip around Chicago until the city itself seemed to pulse to his rhythm. Sam Giancana had arrived at the top, and from that moment forward, he would learn that ruling was harder than rising, and that every step of power gained carried the shadow of a bullet waiting somewhere ahead. When Sam Giancana finally claimed the outfit's crown, it was not done with trumpets or parades. In the underworld, power shifted quietly, like cards sliding across a table. One day, he was the consigliere whose word carried weight. The next, he was the boss whose word was law. Chicago did not wake up to the news with headlines. The city simply felt the change, subtle and undeniable, as money and fear began to flow in new directions, all toward Giancana. The outfit had always been more than one man. It was a machine built by Capone, held together by Frank Nitti, and reshaped by the men who followed. But when Sam stepped into that seat, he transformed it into something broader, sharper, more ambitious. His genius was not in reinventing crime, but in consolidating it. He gathered the threads: gambling, labor unions, casinos, extortion, and braided them into a single rope that only he held in his hands. What made Giancana different was his vision. He did not want Chicago alone. He wanted Chicago as the beating heart of a network that stretched across the country and beyond. Under his leadership, the outfit's influence reached deep into Las Vegas, into Havana, even into politics that touched Washington itself. For the first time since Capone, the outfit looked less like a local syndicate and more like a shadow government. At home, his control was absolute. Street bosses who thought themselves independent quickly learned that independence was an illusion. Giancana had ways of reminding men where loyalty belonged. Sometimes it was a quiet meeting, a warning wrapped in charm. Sometimes it was a body left as a message. Either way, resistance evaporated. The gambling halls ran smoother. The numbers racket fed cash into outfit coffers without interruption, and labor racketeering expanded with the precision of an army taking territory. The police, the judges, the aldermen, many were already in his pocket, but now they moved in lockstep with his command. Those who resisted found themselves pressured until they bent or disappeared. The outfit crown was not a jewel to be admired. It was a yoke of iron that weighed heavy, and Sam wore it with the paranoia of a man who knew it could be taken from him as suddenly as he had seized it. Still, for a time, he was untouchable. To the poor in Chicago's neighborhoods, he was whispered about as a patron, the man who built playgrounds and handed out turkeys at Christmas. To rivals, he was a shadow that fell over every deal. To the city itself, he was invisible, yet everywhere. A ghost king whose reach stretched from the back streets to the boardrooms. Sam Giancana had not just inherited the outfit crown. He had reforged it. In his hands, Chicago's criminal empire was no longer fragmented. It was unified, disciplined, and feared in a way it had not been since Capone. For better or worse, the city now belonged to Mooney, and every man who walked its streets knew it. Once Sam Giancana wore the outfit crown, he did not hide in shadows the way some bosses before him had. He stepped into the light, strutting through Chicago with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the city. Where Frank Nitti had been quiet and reserved, Sam was brash, flamboyant, impossible to ignore. He earned a new persona, one that newspapers and whispers alike would carry: the Dancing Devil. It was a name that captured the contradiction of his life. Ruthless in business, magnetic in public, a man who could order death with the same lips that charmed an audience. Sam loved the spotlight. He was a gangster, yes, but he also fancied himself an entertainer. He moved through nightclubs like they were his personal stage, laughing loud, tipping big, surrounding himself with singers, dancers, and Hollywood stars. He enjoyed the company of famous women, the kind of names that made headlines, and he never missed a chance to remind the world that he could cross from the smoky backrooms of Chicago to the glittering lights of showbiz without missing a step. Money poured from his pockets, and he spent it as fast as it came. Cars gleamed in his driveway. Suits were tailored to perfection. Watches sparkled on his wrists. He wasn't content to live as just another wealthy man. He wanted everyone to see that he was wealthy, powerful, untouchable. Where others cloaked themselves in discretion, Sam cloaked himself in excess. For him, image was not vanity, it was strategy. To look untouchable was to remind both allies and enemies that he was untouchable. But behind the charisma, there was always that glint of menace. He could charm a room one moment and silence it the next with a single glare. Women adored him, men admired him, but all of them knew the cost of being too close to the fire. The Dancing Devil was dazzling, yes, but devils always had their price. His love of show business ran deep. He adored singers like Frank Sinatra, who moved in and out of his orbit, bringing with them a touch of legitimacy that no gangster could buy. He reveled in the glamour of Las Vegas, where entertainers and mobsters mingled freely in casino lounges and backstage corridors. Sam danced in those worlds as easily as he danced across the floor of a nightclub, enjoying the illusion that he was not merely a criminal but a celebrity. The Dancing Devil persona was more than flair, it was armor. It distracted the public, seduced the press, and gave him a mask that made his violence seem almost theatrical. He was a contradiction no one could resist. part killer, part king, part showman. And in that contradiction, Sam Giancana built not just power but legend, a man who ruled Chicago's underworld with one hand while raising a champagne glass with the other. In the years after the Second World War, America shifted its gaze from battlefields abroad to the invisible front lines of ideology. The nation had defeated fascism, but a new enemy now haunted its every step: communism. The Soviet Union loomed like a dark mirror, its red banners waving across Europe and Asia, and in Washington the fear was not just of armies but of ideas. It was a fear that seeped into every corner of American life. The Cold War was not fought with tanks on American soil. It was fought in whispers, in secret deals, in the paranoia that communism might creep into classrooms, unions, newspapers, even movie screens. Every senator, every general, every intelligence officer believed the stakes were nothing less than survival. To lose to Moscow meant more than political defeat. It meant the end of the American dream itself. That fear spread into the streets. Teachers lost jobs for suspected sympathies. Actors were blacklisted, writers silenced, neighbors eyed with suspicion. It was an age when accusation alone could ruin a man. The government fueled this paranoia because paranoia kept the public compliant. Citizens were told to watch, to listen, to report. Even the flicker of dissent was treated like a spark that might ignite the whole nation. And behind the curtain of official speeches and televised warnings, the Central Intelligence Agency was sharpening its teeth. Born in the ashes of war, the CIA became the shadow arm of American policy. Where the military could not act, where politicians dared not tread, the agency moved. They meddled in elections abroad, funded coups, and sought alliances with anyone who could help halt the spread of communism. In this fevered atmosphere, morality was not the measure. Results were. It was in this climate that men like Sam Giancana entered the government's orbit. The outfit was no stranger to influence, but now the stakes were global. Cuba had fallen to Fidel Castro, a communist leader just 90 miles from American shores. The fear of a red tide spilling into the Caribbean turned Washington desperate. And desperation makes strange bedfellows. For Sam, the Cold War was not about ideology. He did not care for the speeches of presidents or the slogans of revolutionaries. What he saw was opportunity. America's obsession with communism opened doors for men like him, men who thrived in shadows. The CIA needed results, and results often came from places polite society dared not touch. The government could not get its hands dirty, but the outfit already had blood on its knuckles. Cold War paranoia gave birth to alliances that blurred every boundary. The lines between patriot and criminal, between national interest and personal profit, began to vanish. And for a man like Giancana, who understood that power was never about purity but about leverage, it was the perfect storm. The shadow of communism stretched across the world, and in that shadow, America was willing to dance with devils. Sam was ready to step forward. The Central Intelligence Agency did not stumble into the world of organized crime by accident. It stepped into it deliberately, with eyes open and hands outstretched. In the early years of the Cold War, when Washington's fear of communism burned hottest, officials realized they needed tools that official channels could never provide. The Soviets were ruthless, disciplined, and willing to do whatever it took to spread their influence. America, they believed, had to be just as ruthless, and who in the United States knew ruthlessness better than the mob? By the late 1950s, Fidel Castro's rise in Cuba terrified policymakers. A communist government planted just 90 miles from Florida was more than a threat, it was an insult. The CIA was tasked with removing Castro, but assassinations and sabotage were not skills taught in West Point classrooms or bureaucratic offices. They needed men who lived outside the law, men who could move without conscience, without oversight, and without hesitation. That is why their gaze fell on Sam Giancana. Giancana was not just another gangster. By then, he was the boss of the Chicago outfit, a man whose reach extended into casinos, unions, and politics. He had connections in Havana from the days when American mobsters treated Cuba as their personal playground, running casinos and nightclubs with government blessing before Castro shut it all down. More importantly, Sam had the kind of men the CIA could use: killers who did not flinch, operatives who did not question orders. There was also another truth the agency could not ignore. The mob had networks that the government could never duplicate. They had safe houses, coded systems of communication, and channels for moving money, weapons, and people without leaving a trace. For an agency sworn to act in shadows, the outfit was a ready-made partner. For Giancana, the arrangement was more than convenient, it was golden. Working with the CIA gave him protection, or at least the illusion of it. If federal agents ever pressed too hard, he could remind them, quietly, that he was serving national interests. It also gave him access, a way to tighten his grip on Cuba if Castro fell, to reclaim the casinos and rackets that had once poured millions into mob coffers. It was an alliance of desperation and calculation, each side pretending the other's sins could be excused for the sake of a greater cause. The CIA needed a devil to dance with, and Giancana fit the role perfectly. He was brutal enough to order a killing without hesitation, cunning enough to manage operations without exposure, and ambitious enough to see in Cuba not just politics but profit. So the lines blurred. The United States government and organized crime, sworn enemies in the daylight, clasped hands in the dark. For the CIA, it was about stopping communism. For Giancana, it was about power and money. Both sides convinced themselves it was necessary. Both sides ignored the cost. And history would remember that in the shadows of the Cold War, America turned to a gangster and called him an ally. When Fidel Castro marched into Havana in 1959, he did more than topple a government. He slammed the door on an empire the mob had built in Cuba. Casinos once glittering with American dollars were shuttered, hotels stripped of their deals, nightclubs silenced. For Sam Giancana and the outfit, it was a personal wound measured in millions lost. For Washington, it was worse, a communist stronghold planted almost within sight of Miami. The problem was not just Castro's rise, but his survival. And so, in the shadows of the Cold War, a decision was made. Castro had to die. The CIA, desperate to cut the head off Cuba's revolution, searched for a way in. They needed killers who understood discretion, who could strike without leaving fingerprints. Their answer was the mob. For Giancana, the request was almost poetic. The agency wanted him to help eliminate the very man who had stolen Havana from under his feet. It was revenge, dressed as patriotism, profit disguised as national duty. The schemes they cooked up bordered on the surreal. Castro was a man of strict routine, and so his habits became blueprints for assassination. One plan called for poisoned pills slipped into his drinks. Another aimed to lace his cigars with lethal toxins, turning his iconic symbol into the instrument of his death. There were talks of contaminating his diving suit with bacteria, of slipping explosives into seashells placed where he loved to swim. It was cloak and dagger mixed with the imagination of a comic book, yet the intent was cold and real. End his life, end his revolution. Giancana and his associates supplied contacts, couriers, and the kind of underworld networks the agency could never access. Miami exiles, Havana dissidents, and mob-connected bartenders all became pieces on a board where every move pointed toward Castro's demise. Money moved quietly, weapons even more so. Meetings blurred the line between federal agents and gangsters, each side pretending they were not dependent on the other. Yet, Castro proved harder to kill than anyone imagined. Assassins stumbled, plans unraveled, poison never reached his lips, explosives never went off. Each failure fed his legend, painting him as a man who could not be touched, a leader somehow immune to the world's most powerful enemies. In Havana, he mocked his would-be killers with speeches, smoking cigars as though daring his enemies to try again. For Giancana, every failure was more than embarrassment. It was opportunity slipping away. If Castro fell, the mob could reclaim Havana's golden days, and the outfit would once again have its playground of casinos and cabarets. Instead, the bearded revolutionary endured, and Sam's secret partnership with the CIA remained a file buried deep in Washington's archives, too dangerous to acknowledge, too scandalous to expose. The Castro problem lingered, unsolved, a thorn in the side of both America and the mob. And though the plots grew stranger, the truth remained simple. The government and Sam Giancana had joined hands to kill a man, and somehow, against all odds, that man survived them all. The alliance between the CIA and Sam Giancana's outfit produced some of the strangest murder plots in modern history. Killing Fidel Castro was not just an assignment, it became an obsession. And in that obsession, the lines between seriousness and absurdity blurred until the plans read less like government operations and more like the dark fantasies of pulp novels. The first idea was simple enough. Pills, small, tasteless, deadly. The CIA developed capsules filled with botulinum toxin, one of the deadliest poisons known to man. A single dose could kill without a trace. The agency passed these pills to the mob, counting on Giancana's network to slip them into Castro's food or drinks. The logic was straightforward. The bearded revolutionary was a man of habits, and habits could be exploited. But the pills never found their way to his plate. Couriers lost nerve, contacts faltered, and the capsules themselves deteriorated before they could ever be used. Then came the cigars. Castro was famous for them, often photographed with a thick Havana smoke between his fingers. The CIA saw opportunity. They commissioned cigars laced with poison, deadly enough to drop him after a single puff. They were packaged, prepared, and even delivered to Havana. Yet fate intervened. The cigars were never handed to Castro. Somewhere in the chain, the plan collapsed, leaving boxes of lethal smokes as grim souvenirs of a plot gone nowhere. The ideas grew stranger still. One scheme called for a diving suit dusted with fungus and bacteria, designed to infect Castro when he put it on. Another suggested planting an explosive device inside a seashell, placed in waters where he loved to dive, the hope being that his curiosity would do the rest. There were whispers of using a pen rigged with a hypodermic needle, of contaminating his coffee, of infecting his handkerchiefs. Each plan seemed more bizarre than the last. Desperate attempts to strike at a man who appeared untouchable. Through it all, Giancana's outfit acted as the middleman, offering contacts in Cuba, smoothing the way for couriers, providing the criminal expertise the government lacked. But even the mob, ruthless as it was, found itself tangled in the absurd theater of espionage. For killers used to bullets and blades, the notion of seashell bombs and poisoned scuba gear must have seemed almost laughable. Yet the money was real, and the partnership with the CIA offered protections too valuable to ignore. Every failure only added to Castro's mystique. To his supporters, he seemed invincible, shielded by fate itself. To his enemies, he became a ghost who slipped through every snare, mocking the most powerful nation in the world. And for Sam Giancana, the plots were a reminder that even devils could stumble when they tried to dance with governments. The CIA wanted results, but what they produced instead was a gallery of poisoned pills and outlandish schemes, none of which ever ended the man they were designed to destroy. Las Vegas, Havana, and Washington formed a triangle that defined Sam Giancana's power in the years when he wore the outfit crown. Each city offered something the others could not, and together they created a stage where crime, politics, and espionage blurred into one performance. It was a triangle of money, secrets, and influence, and Giancana stood in the center, pulling strings like a maestro, conducting a dangerous symphony. Las Vegas was the engine of profit. In the desert, casinos gleamed under neon, and every roll of the dice fed Chicago's pockets. The skim kept flowing, silent streams of money disappearing before they ever touched official ledgers. For Giancana, Vegas was not just a cash cow, it was legitimacy disguised as glamour. He could stand in a casino lounge surrounded by singers, actors, and tourists, and the world would see him less as a gangster and more as a businessman, a man whose empire was dressed in tuxedos and champagne glasses. Havana, before Castro's revolution, had been the mob's playground. American mobsters treated the island like their second Vegas, pouring money into casinos and nightclubs while politicians and police looked the other way. Even after Castro slammed the doors shut, Havana remained central in Giancana's imagination. It was the lost jewel, the stolen kingdom, the prize that might be reclaimed if Washington succeeded in toppling its new leader. That was why Giancana leaned into the CIA's schemes. Killing Castro was not just politics, it was business. If the revolution could be undone, the outfit would return to Havana richer than before, its casinos rising from the ashes of revolution like neon phoenixes. Then there was Washington, the unlikely corner of the triangle. For years, the mob and the government had circled each other like enemies. But in the Cold War, desperation changed the dance. Washington wanted Castro gone, and for that they needed Giancana. The CIA courted him, handing him contracts for murder disguised as patriotic duty. At the same time, politicians hungry for votes knew they could not ignore Chicago's political machines, many of which moved at the outfit's command. Washington gave Giancana something even money could not buy: protection. If the CIA was in bed with the mob, how could the Justice Department truly destroy it? The triangle was fragile, but for a time it worked. Money flowed out of Vegas. Dreams of Havana's return lingered on every deal. Washington kept the arrangement buried under layers of secrecy, convinced that working with devils was better than losing to communists. And in the middle of it all, Giancana danced, half gangster, half statesman, half shadow operative. But triangles have sharp edges. Each corner demanded loyalty, and Giancana's world grew more dangerous with every step. Vegas wanted money, Havana demanded blood, Washington insisted on silence. To balance them all was to walk a tightrope over fire. Sam Giancana thrived in that fire, for a time. Yet every gambler knows the longer you play the triangle, the closer you come to losing it all. Sam Giancana had always enjoyed the glitter of power, but once he became boss, his taste for glamour turned into something larger than indulgence. It became a part of his identity. He was no longer just a gangster counting cash in backrooms. He was a man moving through nightclubs and casinos like a star in his own right. Showgirls, singers, and actresses surrounded him. To the public, it looked like luxury. To those who knew better, it was risk disguised as pleasure. Giancana loved women who carried fame on their shoulders. He was drawn to entertainers whose faces appeared in magazines and whose names filled marquees. They gave him something he craved beyond money: legitimacy. When he dined with a starlet or held hands with a singer, it was as if the lines between Hollywood and Chicago blurred. And for a moment he wasn't just Mooney, the mob boss, he was part of the American dream, sitting under bright lights instead of shadows. But fame brings eyes, and eyes bring danger. Washington tolerated its deals with the outfit, only so long as those deals stayed invisible. Every time Giancana's name appeared alongside a showgirl or an actress, it risked drawing attention to the government's unholy alliances. FBI agents clipped photos, wrote reports, tracked his movements. Politicians who had quietly leaned on mob support winced at the headlines. What was glamorous in the clubs was reckless in the cold corridors of power. Still, Sam could not resist. He hosted lavish dinners, filled with entertainers and politicians alike, where secrets floated over glasses of wine. He had a weakness for showgirls who whispered affection in his ear while listening to the murmurs of business at the table. The CIA had trusted him with plots of assassination, and yet here he was, sharing rooms with women whose fame made discretion nearly impossible. For a man as careful as Giancana, this was his blind spot. The truth was that the glamour gave him cover as much as it gave him risk. A nightclub rendezvous could double as a meeting for business. A woman on his arm made him look like a playboy instead of a conspirator. He cultivated the persona of the dancing devil, the man who could charm a stage full of chorus girls one night and command killers the next. It was all part of the same performance, an act that convinced some he was untouchable. But every performance has cracks. The showgirls and secrets fed his legend, but they also fed his enemies with whispers. Lovers gossiped, photographs lingered, and in the world Sam inhabited, a whisper could be deadlier than a bullet. For Giancana, glamour was never just about pleasure. It was about power, and power always came with a cost. In chasing the glow of fame, he carried shadows into the spotlight, and in those shadows, the seeds of his downfall began to take root. Frank Sinatra was more than a singer with a velvet voice. He was a bridge between two worlds. On one side stood Hollywood and Washington, with its lights, its politics, and its respectability. On the other stood the smoky backrooms of Las Vegas, where mobsters counted money skimmed from casinos and decided who would live or die. In the middle of that bridge was Sam Giancana, and Sinatra became one of his most valuable connections. The friendship between Sinatra and Giancana was not simply about nights of champagne and laughter. It was about access. Sinatra's fame opened doors that even Giancana's money could not buy. Through the singer, mobsters were able to mingle with politicians, actors, and businessmen who might otherwise have kept their distance. And through Giancana, Sinatra found protection, power, and a sense of belonging to something larger than the stage. Vegas was where their worlds overlapped most visibly. The Rat Pack Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, and Joey Bishop turned the desert into their playground. They filled the casinos with crowds, their shows buzzing with energy that spilled from the stage onto the gaming floors. Behind the curtain, though, the outfit was collecting. Every show, every tourist, every dollar fed the machine. The Rat Pack gave Vegas glamour, but men like Giancana made sure the glamour paid dividends. Sinatra's ties to the political world made him even more useful. His friendship with the Kennedy family gave the mob a direct line to Washington at a time when national politics and organized crime were entangled in ways the public could scarcely imagine. Sam Giancana understood the value of this connection. A man like Sinatra could whisper into the ear of a senator at a dinner party and carry mob influence into the very halls of power. Yet the connection was not without risk. The FBI watched Sinatra closely, noting every handshake, every photograph, every rumor of his ties to the outfit. Politicians who once welcomed him grew cautious, afraid that his association with Giancana might stain their own reputations. For Sinatra, friendship with Sam was a double-edged sword. It gave him muscle and mystery, but it also gave him enemies in high places. For Giancana, though, the bond was golden. Sinatra was a star who could legitimize the mob boss's flamboyant persona. Together in Vegas, they looked like kings of two different realms ruling the same desert city, one through music, the other through money. In truth, their connection symbolized the strange marriage of mid-century America, where crime, politics, and entertainment danced together under neon lights. The Sinatra connection showed the world that Sam Giancana was not just another gangster lurking in shadows. He was a man whose reach extended from Chicago's alleys to Hollywood's stages and Washington's corridors. Through Sinatra, he could touch every corner of American power, all while keeping the rhythm of the Rat Pack as the soundtrack to his empire. The story of Sam Giancana and the Kennedys is one of those shadows in American history where rumor and reality blur until no one is certain where truth ends and myth begins. What is clear is that Giancana's world and the Kennedys' world overlapped in ways too precise to dismiss. At the heart of it all was a triangle of politics, power, and crime that seemed impossible. Yet in the desperate heat of the Cold War, it thrived. The rumors began with the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. Chicago was critical that year, its votes carrying weight in a contest decided by the narrowest of margins. Whispers spread that Giancana himself had delivered those votes, leaning on precinct captains, greasing the hands of ward bosses, and ensuring that the outfit's influence pushed Kennedy over the line in Illinois. No proof was ever written, no signed deal uncovered, but in the smoke-filled taverns of Chicago, the story was told as fact. Giancana had helped put a Kennedy in the White House. Then came Cuba. The same administration that benefited from mob-backed muscle now needed mob-backed muscle again. Castro's revolution had shut down Havana's casinos, cutting the outfit's golden pipeline of cash. At the same time, the CIA was desperate to topple the new communist government. Giancana became the bridge. Through shadowy channels, mobsters worked alongside intelligence officers, plotting assassinations with poisoned pills and sabotage disguised as patriotism. It was business, yes, but it also carried the scent of political favor, the idea that the Kennedys knew the outfit was delivering for them behind the curtain. But politics is a dangerous partner. John Kennedy's brother, Robert, was appointed Attorney General and launched a relentless war on organized crime. Courtrooms filled with subpoenas, wiretaps hummed with voices caught off guard, and outfit men found themselves cornered like never before. To Giancana, it felt like betrayal. Had he not helped the Kennedys rise? Had he not worked with the government in its darkest plots? And now, the same family he believed he had aided was trying to tear down the empire he had built. The betrayal fueled conspiracy. Some claimed that back channels remained, that secret deals still tied the Kennedys to Giancana, even as Robert's Justice Department hunted him. Others believed the outfit turned against the family in revenge, their hands somehow involved in the storms of bullets that later shook Dallas. Proof never surfaced, only whispers, but those whispers grew into legend. For Giancana, the Kennedys were both triumph and curse. They represented his ability to reach into the highest halls of power, but they also revealed how fragile such power could be. In the end, the relationship was a mirror of his entire life. Alliances born of desperation, wrapped in secrecy, and remembered not with clarity, but with suspicion. Whether he made the Kennedys or they unmade him remains a question history still cannot answer. Judith Exner stepped into history not as a politician, nor a gangster, nor an agent, but as the woman caught between them. She was young, glamorous, and connected to Hollywood's glittering world, yet it was her relationships that bound her to the darker storylines of America in the 1960s. To some, she was simply a lover of John F. Kennedy. To others, she was the hidden thread that tied the president, Sam Giancana, and the CIA together in one of the strangest entanglements of the Cold War. She first met Kennedy through Frank Sinatra, who often acted as a bridge between worlds. Kennedy was charming, magnetic, impossible to resist. Their affair was passionate but private, cloaked in the secrecy expected of a rising senator who would soon become president. But what Judith may not have realized at first was that her intimacy with Kennedy made her valuable to others, particularly to Sam Giancana. Giancana, too, became her lover, and in the tangled way of things, Judith moved between the president and the mob boss like a figure in a story too unlikely to be true. The CIA, desperate to remove Castro, found itself in this triangle as well. Some accounts suggest that Judith carried messages, that she acted as a courier between Kennedy and Giancana, helping to keep channels open while the agency leaned on mob contacts for assassination attempts in Cuba. She may not have understood the full weight of what she was doing, but she was no longer just a mistress. She was part of a network where politics, crime, and espionage overlapped in dangerous ways. The rumors were explosive. Could the President of the United States really have shared a mistress with a Chicago mob boss? Could that same mistress have ferried secrets between the Oval Office and the outfit? The official record is murky, blurred by denials, contradictions, and missing documents. Judith herself later spoke of her role, but by then, truth and memory were tangled. What remains is the lingering sense that she was a key to understanding how deeply the mob and the government entwined during those years. For Giancana, the affair was leverage. To have a woman tied to both himself and the president was a kind of insurance, a reminder that even in Washington's highest rooms, he had reach. For Kennedy, it was a risk he may not have fully appreciated until it was too late. And for the CIA, it was simply another layer of shadow, another tool in a game where ends justified means. Judith Exner's life became a casualty of these connections. Once seen as glamorous, she ended up marked by scandal, her name forever linked not to the silver screen but to the secret histories of power. In the end, she embodied the truth of that era, that in the Cold War's obsession with secrecy, even love affairs could become instruments of politics, crime, and betrayal. The CIA called on Sam Giancana when it needed the kind of work no one wanted to sign their name to. He was useful in those early years of the Cold War, when Washington's fear of communism outweighed its fear of scandal. Giancana had networks, killers, and contacts in Havana. He could move money, arrange meetings, and whisper orders that the government itself could never give. To the CIA, he was an asset, though a dangerous one, what some began to call their dancing devil. At first, the arrangement was convenient. Giancana wanted Castro gone as badly as Washington did. The casinos and nightclubs of Havana had been the mob's goldmine, and Castro had boarded them up with revolutionary zeal. Killing him meant reopening the river of cash that had once flowed into Chicago. The CIA and the outfit had different reasons, but the same target, and for a time that alignment made sense. But devils do not stay in cages. As Giancana grew stronger, the agency began to realize the cost of their alliance. He was flamboyant, unpredictable, and unwilling to stay in the shadows. His nights with showgirls, his friendships with Hollywood stars, his open presence in Las Vegas, all of it drew attention. For an agency built on silence, his need for spectacle was poison. Worse still, his rumored ties to John F. Kennedy through Judith Exner placed him at the edge of scandal that could have destroyed not just careers but governments. The CIA began to fear the very man it had once courted. He knew too much about plots, about pills, about secret meetings where mobsters and agents had conspired against Castro. If those stories ever reached daylight, they would not only embarrass the government, they would expose how far America had wandered from its own laws. Giancana, with his temper and his ego, was the last man they wanted holding such secrets. Yet, cutting ties was never simple. He was too embedded, too dangerous to simply discard. The agency tolerated him longer than it wanted to, trying to manage the chaos, hoping he would stay silent out of self-preservation. But Giancana was not a man who bowed easily. He saw himself as indispensable, a partner in power rather than a pawn. The more he danced, the more the CIA realized they had not hired a tool, they had unleashed a devil who performed on his own terms. In the end, Giancana's value was outweighed by the threat he posed. Intelligence agencies that once called on him began to whisper about how to contain him, how to silence him if necessary. He had been their dancing devil, spinning between crime and espionage, but devils are never truly controlled. For a time, Sam Giancana served their cause. In the end, he served as a reminder of the danger in striking bargains with men who only dance to their own tune. By the early 1960s, Sam Giancana stood at the very peak of power. Chicago bent under his rule, its heartbeat tied to the rackets he controlled. Gambling was his crown jewel, the steady pulse of cash that never stopped flowing. From neighborhood policy wheels to the glittering casinos of Las Vegas, every wager carried with it a whisper of his name. He had turned the chaos of numbers and dice into a system, one that delivered streams of money as reliable as rivers. But gambling was only the surface. Beneath it lay the labor unions, a fortress of influence Giancana had fortified with bribes, threats, and careful appointments. Contracts for construction, trucking, and shipping all passed under the watchful eye of the outfit. Strikes could be broken or prolonged at his command, factories brought to a standstill or humming again with a single nod. To the men on the streets, it looked like raw muscle. To Giancana, it was strategy. He knew that unions were arteries pumping into the economy, and whoever held them by the throat could make a city kneel. Then came the contracts, the golden prize. Through his control of unions and politicians, Giancana reached into the world of legitimate business. Government deals, construction projects, road repairs, all of it became a second treasury for the outfit. Companies that wanted the work paid their dues, not to City Hall, but to Giancana's men. Some contracts were inflated, others simply stolen, but all served the same purpose, feeding the empire and reinforcing his reputation as the man who could not be bypassed. His rule was not just about money, though. It was about presence. He moved through Chicago with the aura of a king in exile from legitimacy, a man who dined at the best restaurants, laughed in nightclubs, and yet inspired silence when he entered a room. Politicians knew his calls could not be ignored. Judges hesitated before crossing him. Businessmen treated his approval as though it were a license itself. In every layer of the city, from the cab driver to the alderman, the sense was the same. Sam Giancana ran Chicago. Yet even at the peak, shadows lingered. The FBI tightened its grip with wiretaps and surveillance, determined to expose the empire he had built. Rivals inside the outfit whispered in corners, some resentful of his flash, others envious of his reach. Sam himself grew restless, his paranoia sharpening with success. Power had made him visible, and visibility was dangerous. He knew too well how swiftly a boss could be replaced by betrayal, by bullets, or by the law. Still, in that moment, he was untouchable. Gambling, labor unions, and contracts all danced to his rhythm. The city was his stage, and for a time, no one else dared step into the spotlight. Sam Giancana was not merely another gangster. He was the boss of Chicago, and Chicago knew it. At the height of his power, Sam Giancana's reach stretched far beyond the streets of Chicago. He had transformed from a neighborhood gangster into an international figure, a man whose influence crossed oceans and borders. Money, politics, and crime all flowed outward in quiet streams, and wherever they reached, Giancana's shadow followed. Mexico was one of his strongest footholds. The country had long been a crossroads for smuggling, and under Giancana, it became a vital artery for the outfit. Narcotics slipped north across the border. Gambling ventures sprouted under the protection of crooked officials, and money laundering found safe havens in banks and resorts. For the mob, Mexico was more than just opportunity, it was insurance. If the law pressed too hard in the United States, there were always friends waiting south of the border, ready to provide cover. Giancana cultivated those friendships carefully, ensuring that bribes reached the right desks and that loyalty was bought before it could be tested. Cuba remained his obsession. Before Castro's revolution, Havana had been the jewel of the mob's empire, its casinos glittering with profits that rivaled Las Vegas. When the revolution closed those doors, Giancana saw more than a loss. He saw a wound that demanded healing. His involvement with the CIA's plots to assassinate Castro was fueled as much by personal profit as by political purpose. If Cuba could be pried open again, the outfit would return with force, and Giancana would be the man holding the keys. Every scheme, every whispered plan, carried with it the dream of neon lights once more blazing over Havana's nightclubs, the sound of chips clattering under the mob's watchful eye. Even the Middle East entered his orbit. As oil money reshaped the region in the 1950s and 60s, Giancana's associates sought opportunities in construction contracts, banking channels, and international shipping. Rumors swirled of deals struck in Beirut, of money funneled through shadow companies in Lebanon and Jordan. The details were always murky, buried under layers of secrecy, but the pattern was clear. Giancana understood that crime was no longer confined to city blocks. It was global. and the outfit had to move with the times or be left behind. These international ties gave him more than wealth. They gave him leverage. Politicians in Washington knew that Giancana's influence did not end at the edge of Chicago. His networks touched Latin America, reached across the Caribbean, and brushed against the turbulent politics of the Middle East. That reach made him valuable, but it also made him dangerous. He was not just a gangster anymore. He was a man whose empire mirrored the sprawl of the very government that wanted him caged. From Mexico to Cuba to the Middle East, Sam Giancana's name traveled in whispers. He was not seen, but he was felt, a presence in hotel lobbies, in smoke-filled embassies, in the shifting deals that defined an era of global intrigue. His empire was not bound by maps. It was carried on money, on fear, and on the ambition of a man who believed no border could hold him. By the early 1960s, Sam Giancana ruled Chicago's underworld like a king without a crown, but his throne was never secure. Across the country in Washington, another man was watching him with unblinking eyes: J. Edgar Hoover. The director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation had long resisted acknowledging the existence of organized crime, preferring to point his agents at communists and bank robbers. But the evidence became impossible to ignore. Gambling profits, labor rackets, and whispers of political influence painted a picture too bold to dismiss. Giancana was no longer just a gangster. He was becoming a national concern. The FBI moved in quietly at first, planting wiretaps in phones, bugging apartments, and trailing Giancana's every move. They wanted not just to catch him, but to understand the scope of the outfit's power. Hoover's men listened to his conversations, clipped photos of him dining with politicians and celebrities, and filed away notes that would one day reveal the sheer scale of his empire. For Giancana, every phone call became a risk, every meeting a potential trap. The paranoia that already lived inside him now had fuel. Wiretaps caught more than business. They revealed the rhythm of his life, the sudden bursts of temper, the laughter with showgirls, the cautious instructions to lieutenants. To the FBI, the tapes were gold, a window into a world they had only guessed at. To Giancana, they were invisible chains, tightening with every recorded word. He knew he was being watched. He could feel it in the way cars lingered too long outside his home, in the way strangers seemed to recognize him without looking. Hoover, ever the showman, was cautious. He liked his victories clean and his reputation untarnished. He despised Giancana's flash, the way the gangster moved through nightclubs as if he were untouchable. To Hoover, Giancana represented everything he hated: chaos, corruption, and the blending of crime with politics. Yet, even Hoover understood the complications. The whispers of CIA connections, of secret deals with the Kennedys, made Giancana both target and untouchable. To move too quickly risked exposing Washington's own bargains with the devil. Still, the pressure grew. FBI surveillance spread like vines, wrapping around every corner of Giancana's life. Friends were questioned, associates flipped, judges leaned on. Chicago became less a city he controlled, and more a stage where invisible eyes watched every step he took. The boss, who once seemed untouchable, was now cornered by men who played a slower, quieter game. For Giancana, the wiretaps were more than an inconvenience. They were a reminder that power was never absolute. He could command soldiers, bribe judges, and charm celebrities. But against the patience of Hoover's FBI, even the dancing devil could not control the tempo forever. The watchdogs were at the door, and every word he spoke echoed in their files, a prophecy of the reckoning that would one day come. By the middle of the 1960s, Sam Giancana was discovering that power is never a steady crown. The very empire he had fought, schemed, and bled to build, now pressed against him from within as much as from without. Outside forces circled federal agents, politicians eager to clean their reputations, newspapers hungry for a fall. But perhaps more dangerous were the men inside his own ranks, men who owed their fortunes to him yet now measured their futures without him. The outfit had never been a family of loyalty in the romantic sense. It was a machine of profit, where allegiance lasted only as long as money flowed and fear held steady. Giancana's rise had been built on both, but with every year, cracks widened. Rivals saw his flamboyance as recklessness. To them, the nightclubs, the celebrities, and the headlines did not show strength but weakness. A boss who danced in front of cameras was a boss who drew too much light, and light was death in their trade. Capos, who once trembled at his word, now whispered behind closed doors. Some resented his tight grip on the gambling rackets. Others feared his open ties to politics and intelligence operations, worrying that such dangerous entanglements would drag them all down. There were those who saw opportunity in his troubles with the FBI, quietly planning for the day his shadow no longer covered the streets of Chicago. Giancana knew it. He had always been paranoid, but now that paranoia was sharpened by reality, he tested his men with small traps, feeding them bits of false information to see which ones leaked. He shifted crews without explanation, moved money through new hands, and watched the results. The betrayals that came confirmed his suspicions. Some of his closest allies, men he had raised from street hustlers into bosses, were already cutting side deals, lining their pockets while his enemies gathered. Outside, rival mobsters waited like wolves at the edge of firelight. Other families in New York, Cleveland, and Kansas City saw weakness in Chicago's leadership and angled for pieces of its rackets. Vegas skim money that once flowed smoothly began to vanish into other hands. Territories were challenged, contracts rewritten, and in back rooms across the country, Giancana's name was spoken less with respect than with calculation. The double pressure twisted him. To the public he remained the laughing, charming showman, the so-called dancing devil. But inside, the mask was cracking. He ate in silence, traveled with heavier guards, and trusted fewer and fewer voices. The loneliness of power had become the loneliness of siege. Enemies inside and out were not unusual in the life of a gangster. But for Sam Giancana, the danger was greater because he had reached too high, mixed with too many worlds, and exposed himself to too many eyes. When betrayal came, it would not arrive from a stranger's gun, but from the hand of someone who once toasted him as king. In the smoky glow of Las Vegas casinos, where neon lights masked the shadows, Sam Giancana found one of his most lucrative pipelines of power. To the ordinary gambler, the ringing slots and glittering tables promised chance and luck. To Giancana and the outfit, they promised something far more reliable, steady streams of untraceable cash. This was the Vegas skim, the quiet theft of profits before they ever touched official ledgers, and it became the beating heart of the mob's Western empire. The trick was simple in theory but devilish in its execution. Money poured into the casinos night after night. Tourists stacking chips, businessmen losing paychecks, celebrities dropping fortunes just to keep the party alive. At the end of the night, the house counted the take, only not all of it. Skim crews, trusted men handpicked by Giancana and his partners, pulled the cream off the top, cash that never appeared in any book, never reached the tax man, never existed to anyone outside the circle. Bundled bills were spirited away in hidden satchels, stuffed into trunks, and sent eastward under heavy guard. By the time the casinos reported their earnings, a fortune had already vanished into the outfit's coffers. The genius of the skim lay in its invisibility. No theft alarms, no broken safes, just numbers shaved thin enough to escape suspicion. A few thousand here, a few thousand there, multiplied by hundreds of nights, stacked into millions. And those millions fueled everything else: political bribes in Chicago, real estate ventures in Florida, even covert operations whispered about in Washington. The casinos became laundromats not just for money, but for power itself. Giancana was not alone in the racket. The outfit worked hand in glove with families from Kansas City, Cleveland, and New York. Each had a stake, Each had men on the inside ensuring loyalty and silence. But Chicago, under Giancana's reign, commanded the lion's share. His network controlled the flow, his word kept the peace, and his reputation kept the skim untouchable for years. The FBI eventually caught wind. Surveillance mounted. Agents listened at doors and watched from parked cars. Yet even as files thickened, proof slipped through their fingers. The money was always gone before dawn, a phantom trail that left only whispers. It was not until later, long after Giancana's fall, that the full scope of the Vegas skim would be laid bare, revealing the tens of millions siphoned from casino floors and funneled into the underworld. For Giancana, the skim was more than profit. It was proof of his reach, of his ability to turn America's playground into Chicago's private vault. On the surface, he played the part of the showman, rubbing shoulders with Rat Pack crooners and Hollywood stars. But in the counting rooms hidden above the casinos, he was something else entirely, the unseen dealer, always winning, always pulling from the stack before the cards were dealt. Sam Giancana had always craved more than money. Power thrilled him, control steadied him, but fame was something else entirely. In Chicago, he was feared. In Las Vegas, he was respected. But in Hollywood, he could be adored. The lights of the film world shimmered in his imagination, brighter even than the neon glow of the Strip, and he wanted to stand in their reflection. Hollywood offered him something the streets of Chicago never could: legitimacy dressed in glamour. He moved among singers, actors, and comedians as though he belonged, buying dinners, sending roses, slipping into private parties where the champagne never stopped flowing. He loved the aura of stardom, the way cameras turned men and women into something larger than life. For a man who had built his own empire in the shadows, the chance to bask in that light was irresistible. His connection to Frank Sinatra opened doors that no bribe could buy. Through Sinatra and the Rat Pack, Giancana was introduced to a circle where mobsters and movie stars mingled without shame. To Giancana, it was intoxicating. He sat at tables where presidents might call, where the most famous faces in America leaned close to hear his jokes. In those moments, he was not Mooney, the gangster, not the outfit boss. He was Sam, a man of taste, a man of charm, someone who could glide as easily through Beverly Hills mansions as he once did through West Side alleyways. The women of Hollywood drew him especially. Showgirls, actresses, singers, he courted them with gifts and promises, basked in their beauty, as though their spotlight somehow reflected on him. It was dangerous, of course. Every affair risked headlines. Every romance whispered its way back into FBI files. Every jealous rival or loose-lipped starlet carried the chance of betrayal. But Giancana thrived on that danger. The more the Bureau watched, the more he flaunted his lifestyle, dining with celebrities, appearing in photographs that blurred the line between crime and entertainment. What Hollywood never saw, or perhaps chose not to see, was the shadow behind the smile. Giancana could laugh with comedians and toast champagne with starlets, but behind his eyes lived the same paranoia, the same calculating mind that had carried him through decades of blood and betrayal. To him, Hollywood was not just play, it was business. Influence spread differently in California, but it spread all the same. Deals could be made in whispers over cocktails, favors traded behind the curtain of glamour, alliances sealed with a handshake as cameras flashed outside. For Giancana, Hollywood dreams were not about escape, they were about expansion. To stand beside stars was to borrow their light, to weave his myth into theirs, so that one day the world might not remember where celebrity ended and power began. In Hollywood, he was no longer just a gangster. He was a man chasing immortality in the only way America truly understood, through fame. Sam Giancana could be charming when it suited him, a man who laughed loudest at the table and showered gifts on women and friends. But beneath the smile lived something darker, something that flared without warning. His temper was a storm, sudden and merciless, and those who felt it rarely forgot. In the outfit, fear was currency, and Giancana understood that sometimes money was not enough to keep men in line. Sometimes blood was the only language that carried weight. Stories from his reign spread through Chicago like whispered curses. A driver late with a payment might be beaten senseless in front of his own family. A soldier caught pocketing too much from the gambling take might vanish, his body surfacing days later in a ditch outside Cicero. Giancana's men learned quickly that mistakes were survivable, but disrespect was not. He demanded obedience, not only in deed but in tone, in posture, in the way men lowered their eyes when he entered a room. There were moments when his cruelty seemed theatrical, designed to carve fear as deep as any bullet. One tale tells of him forcing a man who had betrayed him to sit at a dinner table, to eat a meal while Giancana recited the list of offenses. When the man could no longer swallow, Giancana gave a nod, and the beating began. Others remembered his voice turning cold, flat, when he ordered reprisals. "Make him remember," he would say, and the message was always clear. Pain was part of the lesson. Even allies were not spared from his outbursts. Capos who hesitated, lieutenants who questioned him, even close friends felt the lash of his rage. To outsiders, these rages looked reckless, but to Giancana they were deliberate tools. Terror tightened his grip on the outfit, as surely as money did. Men who might dream of betrayal thought twice when they remembered the fate of those who crossed him. The FBI heard it on the wiretaps too, the sudden slamming of a hand on a table, the shouting, the threats delivered in coarse bursts. The agents listening could almost feel the fear in the silences of the men on the other end of the line. To Giancana, these moments were not weaknesses, they were performances, reminders to friend and foe alike that he was not a man to test. Yet the violence cost him as well. It deepened his paranoia, isolated him further, and fed the enemies gathering both inside and outside his empire. Fear built walls around him, walls that grew higher with every act of cruelty. Sam Giancana, the dancing devil, might dazzle in nightclubs and Hollywood parties. But behind closed doors, he was something else entirely. A man who believed that power without terror was no power at all, and who left scars as proof of his rule. Sam Giancana ruled Chicago not only from back rooms and smoke-filled meetings, but also from the neon glow of its nightlife. He loved the clubs, the music, the women, and the spectacle that came with being seen. For him, the city after dark was both stage and throne room. Every night he walked into a nightclub, he turned it into his kingdom, and everyone inside knew it. The Copacabana, the Che Paris, the Clover, these were not just venues, they were extensions of his power. The owners knew who really held sway. The waiters hurried to pour his drink before he asked, and entertainers glanced toward his table to see if he was smiling. Giancana liked to sit where everyone could see him, a tailored suit catching the lights, a cocktail in his hand, a woman draped across his arm. The show was never just on the stage, it was at his table. Women flocked to him, not only for his money but for his magnetism. He carried danger like a fragrance, the kind that drew some closer even as it warned them away. Showgirls, singers, and society women all found themselves caught in his orbit. He spoiled them with jewelry, trips, and whispered promises, but he also carried a reputation for jealousy and control. Lovers quickly learned that life with Giancana meant living under his shadow, glamorous yet perilous, adored one moment and discarded the next. The music mattered too. Giancana adored singers like Sinatra, Dean Martin, and Tony Bennett, and his presence in a club could make or break a career. He was the kind of man who could walk backstage after a show, shake a performer's hand, and guarantee them bookings for months simply by showing approval. But just as easily, he could end a career with a sour word or a withheld favor. His influence ran deeper than applause. It dictated the rhythm of opportunity. To ordinary Chicagoans, stories of Giancana's nightlife added to his myth. Some whispered that he was untouchable, a king who partied openly while the law fumbled in the dark. Others cursed him, seeing his champagne and silk as trophies stolen from their sweat and fear. Yet even those who despised him could not deny his presence. His name was tied to the city's glamour as tightly as to its blood. The nightlife was more than indulgence for him. It was power dressed in sequins and song. It was the place where deals were sealed with a handshake over dinner, where alliances formed between courses, where enemies were measured by how long they dared to look him in the eye. Giancana understood that visibility was as important as secrecy. By night he was not just a boss, he was a spectacle, the man who made Chicago's clubs pulse with both fear and fascination. By the late 1960s, Sam Giancana's world had become a cage of whispers. The man who once walked into nightclubs with laughter on his lips now moved like a hunted animal, his gaze flicking from shadow to shadow. Paranoia had always been in his blood, but now it seeped into every corner of his life. He no longer trusted phones, no longer trusted walls, no longer trusted the silence of the night. The FBI had wired his home before, and he knew they would again. Agents slipped into apartments, planted microphones behind plaster, left listening devices in lamps, even tapped his favorite restaurants. Giancana responded with rituals of suspicion. He smashed phones after too many clicks on the line, tore apart furniture in search of hidden wires, and demanded absolute silence before whispering instructions to his men. What once had been simple precautions grew into an obsession, a dance with ghosts that he could neither see nor shake. On the streets of Chicago, he saw watchers everywhere. A car idling too long by the curb, a man in a hat at the corner, a neighbor who glanced up too often. All became enemies in his mind. Sometimes he was right. The Bureau had tails on him nearly every hour. But sometimes the shadows were only shadows, and still, he ordered his men to follow them, to check license plates, to intimidate strangers who had done nothing but cross his path at the wrong time. Inside his own walls, trust crumbled. He accused capos of spying, tested lieutenants with false information, and cut off old allies with no explanation. Even his family felt the chill. He would lower his voice at dinner, stare at the curtains as if they had grown ears, and leave rooms mid-conversation as though pursued by invisible listeners. The house became a bunker, its windows shuttered, its doors bolted, its silence heavy with suspicion. Wiretaps captured fragments of his unraveling. Agents listening in heard him muttering to himself, pausing mid-sentence to demand quiet, snapping into rages that ended in sudden laughter. To the Bureau, it was proof that their campaign of pressure was working. To Giancana, it was proof of something worse, that enemies were not only outside, but inside, his very skin. Paranoia ate away at his nights. He lay awake, listening for footsteps, for the hum of electricity that might betray a hidden bug, for the faint scrape of tires on wet pavement outside. He dreamed of betrayal, of shadows stepping from walls, of guns pressed to the back of his head. Even the mirror offered no comfort. Sometimes he asked his reflection, "Do you believe in me?" And other times he refused to look at all. Sam Giancana, the dancing devil, had once ruled through fear. Now he lived consumed by it. Every whisper, every shadow, every silence became an echo of the same truth. The world was closing in, and trust no longer existed anywhere, not even in himself. By the time the 1960s began to fade into the 1970s, Sam Giancana's grip on the outfit was no longer iron. It was splintering, strained by mistrust, greed, and ambition within his own ranks. The same men who once lifted him up as their leader now whispered against him in back rooms, their loyalty eaten away by fear of his temper and frustration with his decisions. The fractures inside the mob grew louder than the threats outside. Giancana's style of leadership had always been a double-edged blade. His brilliance with numbers, his reach into politics, his connections in Las Vegas and Washington made him a formidable boss. But his flamboyance, his reckless temper, and his insistence on centralizing power around himself alienated many of the capos who expected a share in both authority and profit. Where earlier bosses had been careful to balance egos, Giancana demanded submission, and in the outfit, such demands never went unanswered for long. Discontent rose from the gambling operations, where soldiers muttered that Giancana skimmed too deeply for himself. Others feared his entanglements with the CIA and the Kennedys, seeing them as dangerous games that brought too much heat on Chicago. Some felt his obsession with showgirls and celebrities distracted him from the cold discipline required to run the empire. Every weakness was noted, magnified, and repeated until it became a grievance. The whispers spread across the table at meetings, in whispered conversations in back alleys, in coded messages passed between crews. Rivals sensed opportunity, old enemies inside the outfit, men who had bowed to him grudgingly, began to count their allies and measure the cost of removing him. Even some who once stood closest to him began to wonder if the empire might survive better without its dancing devil at the helm. The FBI's constant pressure only deepened these divisions. Raids, wiretaps, and subpoenas frayed tempers, and each capo looked to Giancana for protection. When he could no longer shield them as he once had, blame turned inward. "Mooney's slipping," they said, using the nickname that mocked his paranoia. "He brings heat and offers no cover." In the underworld, that was enough to invite rebellion. Giancana felt the fractures. He saw the sidelong glances, heard the hollow tones in men's voices, and he tightened his grip instead of loosening it. That only made the cracks spread faster. A boss who trusted no one was a boss who ruled alone, and in the outfit, isolation was death. By the end, his kingdom resembled less a united empire than a house of cards swaying under its own weight. Every capo, every soldier, every ally seemed to hold a knife behind their back. Sam Giancana, who once orchestrated the outfit like a maestro conducting a symphony, now faced the music of dissent. His orchestra was breaking apart, and the song of his power was nearly over. By the early 1970s, Sam Giancana no longer walked Chicago's streets as a king. He slipped out of the city instead, crossing borders not in triumph but in retreat. The walls had closed in federal investigations, FBI surveillance, and betrayal within his own outfit left him cornered. Exile became his only option, and Mexico became his refuge. South of the border, Giancana sought the same comforts he had always craved. Villas with high walls, servants to fetch his meals, women to ease his loneliness. To outsiders, it looked like luxury, but to Giancana, it was gilded confinement. Every knock on the door carried suspicion. Every stranger's glance felt like a watcher's eye. Even in exile, paranoia followed him like a shadow he could not shake. Mexico offered him distance from the FBI, but it was not freedom. The outfit's reach extended there too, and Giancana knew that protection abroad came only as long as he remained useful. He built connections with local officials, greased palms, and surrounded himself with loyal guards, but the truth was clear. He was no longer untouchable. In Chicago, he had been the one giving orders. In Mexico, he was a guest tolerated for his money and influence, a man who could not fully trust the soil beneath his feet. Life slowed in exile. The man who once thrived on the hum of nightclubs and the rush of casino counts now spent long hours pacing courtyards and scribbling in notebooks. He thought often of Havana, of Vegas, of the bright rooms where he once held court. He phoned old associates, tested their loyalty across wires that he feared were tapped. Each conversation deepened his unease, for he could hear hesitation in voices that once pledged devotion. And yet, exile did not strip him of ambition. Giancana schemed even in Mexico, plotting possible comebacks, imagining new ventures, dreaming of a return to Chicago where he could reclaim his throne. He believed, perhaps foolishly, that distance was temporary, that the world had not truly passed him by. But time eroded his grip, and his enemies back home were not idle. Power in the outfit shifted, and with each shift, his place in its hierarchy faded. Still, he remained a figure of fascination. Mexican officials watched him, American agents tracked him, and journalists whispered about the notorious Chicago boss hiding in plain sight just beyond reach. To some, he was a fugitive. To others, a relic of a fading era. To himself, he was still the boss exiled, but not defeated. In truth, Giancana's Mexican exile was less a life of escape than a slow unraveling. The man who once strode through the world with swagger now looked over his shoulder in foreign streets, waiting for the day when hiding would no longer matter, when the shadows he feared would finally catch up, and deep down, he knew that day was coming. By the time Sam Giancana settled into his exile, the FBI had already mapped much of his empire. For years they had listened, watched, and waited, their files thick with transcripts and photographs. Now, in the early 1970s, the Bureau no longer circled in the dark. The net was pulling tight. Federal investigators had learned patience in the long war against organized crime. They had traced the streams of money from Las Vegas casinos, followed whispers of narcotics shipments, and documented Giancana's ties to labor unions. His name surfaced again and again in hearings and reports, a ghost behind contracts, a shadow in backroom deals. Hoover's death in 1972 had opened the door for a new generation of agents, less bound by his reluctance to publicly acknowledge the mob. Suddenly, Giancana's world was under brighter scrutiny than ever before. Wiretaps carried his voice into federal offices. They heard his rages, his suspicions, his commands clipped and coded but clear enough to piece together the machinery of the outfit. Informants, too, began to speak. Men once loyal to him weighed their freedom against silence and chose cooperation. Each betrayal became another nail in the coffin of his power. Subpoenas arrived like blows. Grand juries in Chicago wanted testimony, wanted names, wanted cracks in the wall of omerta. The Justice Department pressed cases tied to gambling and extortion, each thread woven into a larger web. Even in Mexico, Giancana felt the pressure. Extradition loomed, whispered across phone lines, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the walls abroad proved no safer than those back home. The Bureau did more than investigate, they isolated him. By leaning on judges, freezing assets, and flipping lieutenants, they cut him off from the roots that had sustained his empire. The man who once commanded unquestioned loyalty now found his calls, returned with hesitation, his orders met with excuses. Each move revealed how far his influence had slipped. Giancana's paranoia, already sharp, now bordered on desperation. He smashed telephones after hearing faint clicks, refused to speak in rooms he had not swept himself, and accused even old friends of spying. He knew the Bureau was closing in, but he could not guess from where the final strike would come. The FBI did not need to put a bullet in him. They only needed to wait, to squeeze, until his allies abandoned him and his empire collapsed under its own weight. In those years, Giancana stopped being the untouchable king of Chicago. He became a cornered man, a boss stripped of certainty, a fugitive in plain sight. And while the Bureau built its case with quiet patience, Giancana lived every day with the knowledge that his past had finally outpaced him, and that the reckoning he had outrun for decades was now at his door. When Sam Giancana finally returned to Chicago in the mid-1970s, it was not the triumphant homecoming of a king reclaiming his throne. It was quieter, heavier, marked by the weight of years in exile and the knowledge that the city he once ruled no longer bowed to him. He stepped back onto familiar streets, but they did not feel familiar. Chicago had changed, and so had he. The neighborhoods that once whispered his name now spoke of other men, new bosses who had risen in his absence. The outfit had moved forward without him, dividing rackets and reshaping power in ways he could no longer control. Casinos in Las Vegas were still bleeding money into mob pockets. Unions were still bent under unseen hands, but Giancana was no longer the one pulling strings. Where once his word had been law, now it was treated like an echo heard, but not obeyed. He came home under the watchful eye of the FBI. Agents followed his car, monitored his visits, logged his every meeting. There was no space for him to move freely, no nightclub where he could sit without eyes at the door. The same city that once feared him now studied him like a specimen, waiting for a misstep, waiting for proof that his power was not only diminished but broken. Giancana tried to rekindle old flames, reaching out to allies, pressing for loyalty. But loyalty had thinned during his years in Mexico. Men who once toasted him had built their own empires. Some welcomed him politely, but behind the smiles was calculation. To them, Giancana was not a leader anymore. He was a liability. His return brought too much heat, too much attention, too many questions about past deals with the CIA and the Kennedys. Even the city's rhythm had shifted. Nightclubs no longer roared with the same energy. Faces in the papers had changed. Chicago's underworld, though still thriving, had adapted to survive in subtler ways. Giancana's flash, his loud suits and louder lifestyle, felt outdated in an era where discretion meant survival. The spectacle that once made him untouchable now marked him as out of step with the times. For all his attempts to project strength, Giancana could feel the distance. The city he loved had moved on. The outfit he built had reshaped itself around men less flamboyant, more cautious, and less entangled in politics. His own legend, once untouchable, now worked against him. He was too well known, too visible, too watched. Back in Chicago, Giancana lived in a strange twilight. He was home, yet not welcome. He was alive, yet already half a ghost. The streets remembered him, but they no longer belonged to him. And for the first time in decades, Sam Giancana was forced to face a truth he had always denied, that even kings of the underworld are not immortal, and that a city can forget its ruler long before his body is laid in the ground. Sam Giancana had always believed fear and money were enough to keep men close. For a time, that belief held true. Soldiers bowed their heads, capos carried out his orders, and allies in politics and business kept his name whispered but powerful. Yet by the time he returned to Chicago, the currents of loyalty had shifted. Men who once swore undying allegiance began to weigh their options, and in that calculus, Giancana's survival became less valuable than his silence. His absence in Mexico had given others room to grow. Power never sits idle, and while Giancana hid behind high walls, younger bosses carved out their own empires. When he came back, they saw not the dancing devil of old, but an aging man dragging too much heat. To them, his name was no longer protection, it was danger. They shook his hand, poured him drinks, and smiled at dinners. But behind the pleasantries lurked sharpened intentions. Some of his closest allies began to distance themselves. Calls went unanswered. Promises grew thin. A man he once trusted with gambling revenues quietly shifted profits into new channels, cutting Giancana from the flow. Another capo, long considered loyal, began to court rivals, building alliances in preparation for a world without Mooney. Even whispers of his past with the CIA and the Kennedys, rumors that had once made him seem untouchable, now made him radioactive. No one wanted to be standing beside him if those secrets ever spilled, Giancana noticed. He had lived his life reading men's eyes, and now he saw doubt staring back where loyalty once lived. He tested them, dropping hints, asking questions, probing for truth. What he found confirmed his worst fears. Friends had become careful, cautious, unwilling to share plans. Some avoided him altogether, their loyalty dissolved by ambition or self-preservation. The paranoia that already consumed him deepened. He refused to sit with his back to a door, refused to eat food prepared outside his sight, refused to believe in loyalty without proof. And yet, for all his precautions, he could not stop the erosion. The outfit was no longer united under his shadow. It was circling, each man gauging the risk of standing by him against the reward of stepping aside or even pushing him out. What made it worse was the silence. No declarations, no open defiance, just the slow turning of the tide. Giancana, once surrounded by allies, now sat alone, his circle shrinking with every passing week. He had built his empire on fear, but fear is fickle, and when it falters, even the closest friends become foes. Sam Giancana could sense the end. Not from the FBI, not from rival cities, but from the men who had once lifted their glasses in his honor. In the end, the greatest danger was not the strangers in dark cars, it was the familiar faces waiting for their moment to strike. By the mid-1970s, Sam Giancana's life had narrowed to the walls of his own home. Once the master of nightclubs, casinos, and backroom deals, the man who had moved presidents and played with spies now lived under the suffocating weight of constant surveillance. It was not an official prison, but it may as well have been. The King of Chicago was under house arrest, his every step tracked, his every call monitored, his every visitor noted. FBI agents camped outside his home on Winona Avenue in Oak Park, their cars parked along the street day and night. Neighbors grew used to the sight of men with cameras and notebooks, watching as though the gangster's quiet suburban house was a stage. For Giancana, the irony was bitter. He had once been a ghost, feared but rarely seen, a man who ruled from the shadows. Now his life was exposed to the light, each movement catalogued, each shadow pierced by government eyes. The old routines that once defined him, the late-night feasts, the glamorous women, the smoky back rooms were stripped away. Meals were simple, days monotonous. He would sit for hours at his kitchen table, the blinds drawn, a glass of whiskey in hand, listening to the faint crackle of his radio. Even the phone, once his lifeline, was now his enemy. He rarely dared to speak freely, convinced each line carried more wires than words. Visitors came cautiously, if at all. Some old associates stopped by, speaking in clipped phrases, their eyes darting toward the parked cars outside. Others avoided him altogether, unwilling to risk being seen. His house became a fortress of silence, not from guards, but from isolation. The once vibrant king of the nightlife now paced his hallways like a restless prisoner, trapped by forces he could neither bribe nor intimidate. Giancana's paranoia deepened in this cage. He believed his home itself was bugged, that microphones hid in the walls, that even the floors creaked with listening ears. He muttered to himself, sometimes louder, as if daring unseen watchers to make sense of his words. Friends recalled his temper sharpening in those years, his laughter rarer, his suspicions darker. The man who had built an empire through fear was now consumed by it. Still, he clung to illusions of control. He dressed in sharp suits even when no one would see him, polished his shoes as though preparing for business that never came. He told himself the surveillance was temporary, that one day the FBI would tire and the outfit would call him back into its embrace. But the truth gnawed at him. The outfit no longer trusted him, the government would never release him, and the walls around his quiet Oak Park home were closing tighter by the day. House arrest was not just confinement, it was humiliation. For Sam Giancana, it was the cruelest punishment of all, not a violent end in the streets, but the slow erosion of power, forced to live like a caged king, stripped of both throne and crown, with only his memories left to remind him of who he once was. On a warm June evening in 1975, Sam Giancana sat down to what would be his last supper. The house on Winona Avenue smelled of garlic and simmering tomato, a comfort from the old days when family meals could soften even the hardest hours. Friends and a cook prepared the pasta, and for a brief moment the weight of surveillance, betrayal, and paranoia seemed to fade. There was food on the table, wine in the glass, and laughter that echoed faintly in the kitchen. He was in good spirits that night, or at least he pretended to be. Giancana told stories, gestured with his fork, and let the warmth of familiar company dull the edge of his isolation. It was a scene almost ordinary, an aging man, sharing pasta and red wine, enjoying the smallest of freedoms within walls that felt like a cage. But for a man who had lived by blood and betrayal, ordinary never lasted long. The ambush came not in the streets or in a smoky alley, but in the comfort of his own home. After the plates had been cleared and the laughter thinned, Giancana moved into the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, perhaps reaching for dessert, perhaps for a late-night snack. In that moment, someone stepped from the silence with a gun. The first shot struck the back of his head, dropping him against the open door. 6 more followed, ripping through his body, shattering the quiet with the thunder of finality. Neighbors would later recall the sound, sharp cracks carried into the night. By the time anyone reached him, the King of Chicago lay crumpled on his own kitchen floor, the tile stained with the end of a legend. The FBI, camped outside, had not stopped it. The outfit, fractured and cold, had delivered its verdict. Whether it was fear of what he might reveal, punishment for past arrogance, or the settling of debts, the message was clear. Sam Giancana would not live to tell his secrets. The refrigerator door hung open as his body cooled, the smell of pasta and garlic still lingering in the air. It was a cruel irony after decades of surviving gunfights, federal investigations, and foreign exile. Giancana met his end not in a blaze of glory but in a kitchen, felled between a plate of leftovers and a bottle of wine. News spread quickly. Some called it justice, others called it betrayal, but all understood its weight. The man once called Mooney, the so-called dancing devil, had been silenced. His final meal was not only food, it was a ritual, a reminder that even kings fall, and often not on battlefields but in the places they once felt safest. And so Giancana's story ended, with pasta, laughter, and 7 bullets carving the last word. The scene inside Sam Giancana's Oak Park home on that June night in 1975 was as ordinary as any suburban evening could be. A kitchen table, the smell of pasta lingering, glasses still wet with wine. Yet, what unfolded there turned the quiet space into one of the most infamous crime scenes in Chicago's history. Giancana, the man who had dined with presidents, plotted with spies, and ruled the outfit with fear, died not in a smoky back room or on a crowded street, but in the kitchen of his own house. The attack was fast, clinical, and brutal. He was standing at the refrigerator when the first shot struck the back of his head. The bullet dropped him instantly, his body crumpling against the door. But his killer was not finished. 6 more rounds tore into him, each one fired with deliberate intent. 2 struck his face, leaving no doubt of the executioner's message. This was not just murder, it was erasure. A mobster's life was ending, and his legend was being scarred beyond repair. Neighbors later said they heard the rapid cracks of gunfire, sharp enough to slice through the summer night. But by the time police arrived, the killer was long gone. The refrigerator door remained ajar, its pale light spilling over Giancana's body, casting the kitchen in an eerie glow. The floor was slick with blood, a red pool spreading across the tiles where he had once stood in command. The details stunned even seasoned investigators. Giancana had been under government surveillance, with agents parked just outside his home. Yet no one had stopped the killing. No one had seen the assassin slip in or out. That failure fed rumors that his death had been allowed, or even arranged, to silence him before he could reveal what he knew about the mob's ties to politics and the CIA. The placement of the bullets told its own story. The first in the head to ensure death, the rest to send a message. In mob tradition, shots to the face were not only execution, they were humiliation, stripping a man of identity. For Giancana, a man who had craved fame as much as fear, the symbolism was chilling. The gangster who had built his life on being recognized was left unrecognizable. In the days that followed, photographs of the blood-soaked kitchen circled through newsrooms and law enforcement files. Reporters called it the end of an era. To the FBI, it was a case study in failure. To the outfit, it was closure, a final chapter written with bullets instead of words. Sam Giancana had always believed he would die violently. What he could not have known was that the end would come in the most ordinary of places, surrounded not by soldiers or enemies in the street, but by the quiet remains of a meal. His empire gone, his secrets bleeding into the floor. The question of who ended Sam Giancana's life has lingered for decades. a shadow as enduring as the man himself. On the night of his murder in 1975, 7 bullets silenced him forever, but the identity of the hand that pulled the trigger remains a matter of speculation, conspiracy, and whispered theory. For some, it was nothing more than mob justice, the outfit erasing a boss who had outlived his usefulness. For others, it was something darker, a silencing orchestrated by the very government agencies that once courted his services. The simplest explanation points to the outfit. Giancana had returned from Mexico weakened, his power fractured, his presence a burden. He was under FBI surveillance, bringing constant attention to a world that thrived in shadows. His paranoia and arrogance had created rifts, and his old allies no longer saw him as an asset. To them, his removal was inevitable. The mob had always settled its disputes with blood, and Giancana's death fit neatly into that tradition. A capo eliminated, a problem solved, an empire redistributed. Yet, the timing raised questions. Giancana had been scheduled to testify before a grand jury investigating CIA involvement in assassination plots against foreign leaders, including Fidel Castro. The very day he was murdered, he was expected to speak about his role in those schemes. To some, the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. What better way to ensure silence than to strike before his testimony could begin? The CIA, after all, had used him when convenient and discarded him when dangerous. If his secrets threatened to expose the shadowy overlap of politics, espionage, and organized crime, his death might have been the cleanest solution. Others believe the truth may lie in the overlap of both worlds. The outfit and the CIA had shared him before, each using his talents, his networks, his ruthlessness. Perhaps his death was not ordered by one or the other, but tolerated by both. A mutual understanding, spoken or unspoken, that Sam Giancana had become a liability. The mob rid itself of a fading boss. The government erased a witness who knew too much. One body, 2 birds struck with the same bullets. Rumors swirled for years afterward. Some pointed to his own men, executing him on orders from higher up in the outfit. Others claimed a CIA-connected assassin carried out the hit under the cover of mob tradition. The lack of arrests, the silence of official investigations, only deepened the mystery. Each unanswered question added fuel to the legend, ensuring that the truth would remain as elusive as the man himself. In the end, the identity of the killer may matter less than the message. Whether it was vengeance, silencing, or both, Giancana's death proved that even the most powerful gangster could not outrun the forces he courted. He had danced with devils in both crime and government, and when the music stopped, all that remained was the echo of 7 shots in a kitchen and a question no one dared answer outright. Who pulled the trigger? In the years that followed Sam Giancana's death, his story did not fade into silence. If anything, it grew louder, heavier, reshaped into legend. The man once known as Mooney, the so-called dancing devil, became more than just a Chicago gangster. He became a symbol, a riddle, and a myth whispered in the overlap of crime, politics, and espionage. Death had ended his life, but it only deepened his legacy. For the outfit, Giancana's assassination closed a chapter. Yet his name never stopped haunting the city. In the neighborhoods where he had once been feared, people told stories of his generosity, of envelopes of cash slipped to families in need, of favors granted without explanation. Others recalled the bombs, the bullets, the terror he left in his wake. Chicago carried both memories at once, never quite able to decide whether to mourn him or spit at the mention of his name. Journalists and authors rushed to capture his story. Books painted him as a gangster who had crossed into the world of international intrigue, a man who sat at the intersection of the mob, the CIA, and the White House. Documentaries replayed his rise and fall, lingering on the blood-soaked tiles of his Oak Park kitchen. Each retelling polished or twisted the tale, turning a life of crime into something mythic, something bigger than the man who had lived it. The conspiracy theories ensured his immortality. Some insisted the outfit killed him to silence dissent. Others swore the CIA eliminated him to bury secrets of Castro plots and Kennedy ties. A few whispered of both, a joint decision to erase a man who knew too much. The lack of answers made the legend stronger. The mystery was the fuel, keeping his ghost alive long after his body was buried. Even in popular culture, Giancana's shadow stretched. Films borrowed pieces of his life. Singers who once toasted him dropped his name in memoirs, and television dramatized his romances and betrayals. To the public, he became part gangster, part celebrity, part spy. He was no longer just a man, but a story to be told and retold, each version more dramatic than the last. For his family, the legacy was heavier. His children and grandchildren lived with his name like an inheritance they could neither spend nor escape. Some defended him, others condemned him, but all carried the weight of being tied to a figure larger than life. His lovers, his friendships with the Rat Pack, his rumored ties to the Kennedys, every thread of his life was pulled into the tapestry of his myth. Sam Giancana's true legacy is contradiction. He was feared and loved, powerful and paranoid, ruthless and charming. In death, the contradictions only multiplied, leaving behind not a clean history but a tangled myth. The Devil's legacy was not just blood or money. It was the echo of a life lived in the blurred space between power and performance, a myth that refuses to die, just like the man who once believed he could dance with shadows forever. Sleep now, for the story has reached its final note. Sam Giancana, the boy from Chicago's West Side who clawed his way from alleys to empires, no longer walks in shadow. The devil who once danced with presidents and spies, who reveled in neon nights and whispered deals, lies quiet beneath the earth. His reign ended not with triumph but with 7 bullets in a modest kitchen. His kingdom dissolved into silence. The world he built in fear and spectacle has passed, leaving behind only echoes. Close your eyes and imagine the city he once ruled. The clubs glowing, the music spilling onto the streets, his laughter loud above it all. Then imagine how it dimmed, how the same streets turned cautious, how whispers grew heavier than songs, how even his closest allies measured his worth in shadows and decided he was too heavy to carry. His fall was not sudden, not clean. It was slow, unraveling, the steady collapse of a man who believed he could outwit both time and trust. And yet, he lingers, not in flesh but in myth, in the books written, the films made, the conspiracies repeated in late-night conversations. Some remember him as ruthless, others as magnetic, still others as a bridge between the mob, Hollywood, and Washington. He is all of these and none of them, a man caught forever between fact and legend. The Devil's Dance ended that night in Oak Park, but the music has never quite stopped playing in memory. Now let the weight slip away. You have carried his story, his rise from a hungry child to a feared boss, his entanglement with the CIA, his obsessions, his betrayals, and his violent end. You have walked with him through alleys, across casino floors, into secret meetings, and finally into the quiet of his last meal. The tale is done, so breathe. Let the noise of gunfire fade. Let the voices of wiretaps fall silent. Let the neon lights dim until the streets are still. Sam Giancana's dance is over. No more paranoia, no more whispers, no more devil in the night. Just a closed chapter, folded into history, left behind in the dust of Chicago. Rest now. The story is no longer yours to carry. The devil dances no more.